Hi everyone. Well, we're down near the end, right? Because as you saw from I've talked about this in the lectures I put up for the last bit of labs that we needed, and excuse me, my previous video for lecture that went up just a few minutes ago. Today's Thursday the 23rd. If you'll notice on your tentative course calendar that we were following pre-COVID-19, it has test 6 on chapters 1, part 2, 2, 3, and bioterrorism. And so if you'll notice here, we're almost near the end because this video is going to cover chapter 1, part 2, and chapter 3. So all we'll have left is bioterrorism. And then we'll be finished up. And then, like I said, you will not have test 6. Okay? But you will have your final, and some of that information could be on your comprehensive lecture final exam, which you will know today whether that is going to be on May the 5th or not, and how long that'll be open and all that. I'm going to get you all that information. Don't worry. You also have a study guide that's specifically for both your comprehensive lecture final exam and for your lab exam. So make sure once you take test number 5, which is already up, and lab quiz number 5, which is already up. Once you take those two and get them out of the way, then all you have to do is make sure you cover this material as you want to know it, okay, for your certification exam, for Allied Health 211, because this information is vitally important to make you to be the best professional phlebotomist you can be. It'll also help you if you decide to move forward in your career. If you're going to go to nursing school, if you are going to go to respiratory therapy school, clinical laboratory science, I'm telling you, you want to pay attention to every bit of this, because the more you know now, the more it'll be easier for you to learn down the road, okay? So make sure you're watching these videos, make sure you're reading the corresponding chapters in your textbook, fill out your study guides, and everybody knows my tests come directly from the study guides, right? Because there's information I know you need to know to pass the certification exam. There's information I know you need to know so that you will be the best phlebotomist you can be in the field. So I make sure that I hammer that information into you so that you will know it, because you know the best way to learn is repetitive, right? Go over and over and over. Now, one of the good things about us doing this, and there's not that many good things because I want to be in the classroom and see your smiling faces, but is that you can pause these videos and take the time to read this stuff. Now, these are our learning objectives, and they're here because these are the objectives that I have and that you have. After studying this chapter, after you read chapter 3, okay, after you read the second part of chapter 1, after you watch these videos, after you fill out your study guides and you start studying, these are the things that you should know, okay? You should be able to define basic ethical and legal terms. You should be able to differentiate, I'm sorry guys, I can't talk this morning, between informed consent and implied consent, okay? You should be able to describe how to avoid litigation, okay? You should be able to define your standard of care, identify key elements of HIPAA, list key factors in liability insurance policies, okay? List common issues in lawsuits against healthcare providers and prevention tips to avoid lawsuits in phlebotomy, okay? So these objectives are also listed on chapter 3 in your textbook, when chapter 3 starts on page 84. And as I've told you many times, guys, if there's a word in here that you hear that word and you say, what does that word mean? That happens to all of us. I can't tell you, I'm a big reader. I like to read, okay? And if I come across a word, and I do all the time when I'm reading a book, that I don't know what that word means, okay, I either highlight it with my marker, highlight it in my little tablet, or I make a note of it, and I make sure that I go on Google and Google that word so that I will know what it means. If you're reading this and you don't know what litigation means, there's no shame in that. The only shame is when you don't make the effort to try to educate yourself. Keep yourself informed, okay? If you want to succeed in life, The people who really succeed are those people who are hungry for knowledge. Those people that want to know. They want to be informed. They want to be educated. Okay? And that's not something that happens overnight. And I hope there never comes a day in my life where I'm not being informed and I'm not seeking education. I constantly want to learn. I want to keep my mind sharp, so that the research is out there that if you're trying to avoid early onset dementia, Alzheimer's, those types of things, that reading, playing word games, things like that to constantly challenge our mind are things that keeps our mind sharp. So keep that in your mind, and make sure if you run across words in your study guides, in your chapters, on your PowerPoint presentations, and you don't know what it means, Google it. Send me an email. Ask me. It's just going to make you smarter. Okay? So, and they can't take that away from you, right? So, we make sure you're reading those objectives. Make sure you're following them through, reading your chapters in your textbook. Okay? So, moving from here, guys, there's three things. Okay? There's laws, there's ethics, and then now in this modern day we have bioethics. Okay, so laws. We know there's laws, right? There's speeding laws, right? It says you only need to drive 25 miles an hour down the street I live on. Okay? Now, a lot of people don't like to follow the laws because in their mind they don't see the sense in it. If you don't see the sense in a law, go and investigate it, because sometimes there is a method to the madness. And I'm going to be honest with you. 25 miles an hour, you should be driving that down my road, okay? Because it's a neighborhood, right? Little kids play in the front yard. What if your dog accidentally gets out and runs across the road? If you're going 25 miles an hour and you're obeying these speed limit laws, you would have time to react and put your brakes on. People walk in my neighborhood. People ride their bikes in my neighborhood. And if you are not obeying those speed laws, if you're just cutting through my street, doing 40 miles an hour through here, you could accidentally run over somebody's child if they're playing in the front yard and the parents are watching them. And we all know how kids are. We try to train and teach our children, hey, don't run out in the road. But you know how a small child can be if they're playing with a ball in the front yard and you're right there watching them and you're telling them constantly, don't get near the road, but their ball flies out into the road. Before they think and before you could react, they may run out into the road to grab their ball. If somebody is cutting through your street driving 40 miles an hour, they may not have time enough to react and they're going to hit your child. And I'm going to tell you something, guys, and we'll go through this as these videos go through when we talk about ethics. You know, it's one thing to be frustrated or aggravated at having to go that slow when you're driving down the road, but when you make decisions to break the rules, sometimes, and I think this makes us complacent and adds to the problems, because sometimes you break the rules and you break the rules and you break the rules and you never get caught. But sooner or later, your time's going to come and you're going to get caught. And it's one thing to get caught speeding and the police officer writes you a citation and you have to pay a fine and possibly your insurance goes up or whatnot. But if you were to accidentally kill someone's child, you have to live with that decision for the rest of your life. And I know it's easier for us to say, hey, I'm running late for an appointment. I'm running late for work. This is dumb. I just want to get to where I'm going. I don't care about this. That's stupid to drive 25 miles an hour. That's just going to be the time that somebody's little kid is going to run out in the road and you are going to have to live with that for the rest of your life. So just be careful. Sometimes it's better to be late. Sometimes it's better to just take a deep breath and calm down so that you don't have to make a decision that very well could make you live with something for the rest of your life. Think about young men out there who make mistakes. You know, they do things that they weren't thinking. Things happened in the passion of the moment, the heat of the moment, an argument, and they're scared. They accidentally they pull a gun because they're trying not to be scared of the environment they're in. The gun accidentally goes off and someone gets killed. Not only do they have to live with the fact that they took somebody's life, but they may possibly have to spend years and years, maybe even the rest of their lives in jail over one moment in time. So laws are important, guys. And remember, those are those rules that we as a society set up. And like I told you, if you don't understand why a rule is out there, why a law is out there, look it up. Because a lot of times there is a real method to this madness, of reason they have these rules and regulations. Now, I do realize there's some rules and regulations, but that's usually the minority of the ones that we don't understand, okay? They're set up when you have this many people, millions and billions of people living on this earth, trying to work together, trying to be respectful and understand of everybody else's freedoms, then if we do not have laws, we can have chaos. But you need to know the difference between laws and ethics. So what are ethics? Okay, those are our moral standards, right? We're taught, hopefully we're taught, and if we don't, hopefully as we grow older, we begin to understand that about our behavior or our conduct and your individual actions. Okay, that's your ethics. Sometimes we see something and we're faced with it and we know we're not really breaking the law, but what we're doing is just not right. We feel it in our bones. Those are ethics. You guys need to look at that. It's very important. We've had a lot of, if you've never heard of the Tuskegee experiment, go out there and look at that. There's books out there about it. There's documentaries. It's vitally important that we know that in the name of healthcare, so to speak, we've made some very poor decisions in the past. And we've had to have laws and rules and regulations put into place to make sure that these things don't happen anymore. And that deals with our bioethics, right? Because now that we have such modern medicine and we can do clinical research, we have lots of technology out there, we need to make sure that we are putting our ethics in place when it comes to medicine, okay? So, it's like this little picture right here shows down here at the bottom. This is obviously, it looks like a surgeon in there or somebody working in a surgery. And they say, did I just lose my right contact? Okay, you got two choices right there at that point. You're either going to say something about it, okay, which, yes, I understand that it could make you, humiliate you, embarrass you, make you look bad. Maybe it even gets you in trouble, okay? But what's more important? You maybe being reprimanded. Maybe maybe you're ashamed for a few minutes for doing something dumb or had something dumb happen, or you let that contact get into that patient. Something goes wrong with that patient. It makes them either very sick and maybe has some disability they have to live with for the rest of their life, or they could die. So never take that whole, don't even start going down that slippery slope of, oh, well, no one ever notices, because I've noticed, and research is out there, that when people see that they can get away with stuff over and over again, they're more have a tendency to do it. These are good people. It's not bad, evil people. Not everybody's evil that does this stuff. But I think what happens is once you make that decision to not be trusted, not be honest, to not tell the truth, to not be that person that puts what's best ahead of what's best for you. When we start going down that road, sometimes it's like they say, a very slippery slope, and it's difficult to get back. So you guys make sure you're going into your textbook. We have ethics. There's some even broader definitions of laws, ethics, and bioethics. We have an ethics overview there. And then we have other examples of ethical behavior for healthcare workers. We have a lot of stuff in here that will help you really understand some different scenarios other than this one with the contact lens that may happen to you, and kind of what's the best way to handle that. So, like I said, with the contact lens situation here, we all are, you're going to be faced with an ethical decision at some point in time when you're out there working. Maybe even when you're out there doing your clinicals. Okay, it's going to happen. It's not will it happen, it's just when will it happen. Okay, and you want to make sure that you're evaluating these difficult situations, and you want to ask yourself, okay? Is it legal and does it comply with that institutional policy? That's the first and foremost thing. The last thing you would want to do is do something ethically wrong that was morally wrong, that was legally wrong, because you're just putting yourself in a very bad position where something bad could happen. You also want to know, is this a win-win situation for people? Okay? And also, we all read stories about terrible things that happen in nursing homes or hospitals where healthcare workers, all the way from doctors down to people that work environmental services, do things that hurt, harm, disable patients. Just some terrible stuff we read about from time to time. And it's always easy to put that in a little box and say, oh, look what that person did. They're terrible. But what we need to remember is we could make these same decisions. We could decide to do some things that are ethically not good, and it could end up in the newspaper. And how would you feel? Okay? How do you feel when you read those stories? How would you feel if that happened to your family? So make sure you're thinking all this stuff through, especially about, could you live with yourself? Okay? And last but not least, most of us always know in our heart that what we're doing is either right or wrong. And sometimes you need to listen to that. And then I would rather go, and if I knew that I had made a mistake, I'm just going to go tell somebody. And I'm going to be honest with you. If these are simple mistakes that you rarely ever make, and you go to them and talk to them about it and tell them, and they can catch that mistake before anybody is hurt, yes, you may be written up for that. Yes, you may be reprimanded. Yes, you may have to go back and do some training, which you may very well need, okay? But most of the time, they're not just going to fire you over one mistake that you bring to their attention, okay? It shows you're trustworthy, you can be trusted, that you are going to be honest even if it puts you in a bad position. And a lot of times that really makes you look good to your supervisor. Now here's one of our critical thinking slides, right, where we want to analyze a situation and see how we would handle it. So you can pause these videos, okay, and then write down what you think you would do and see if that corresponds. You realize you made a mistake in identifying a patient. Should you report it? Yes or no? Of course. Yes, you do. Okay? But this is why I try to train you guys to not even make that mistake. Okay? And something that we need to realize is when you see these people cutting corners, and I hear it, oh, y'all have no idea how many times I hear class after class after class coming in the intro to phlebotomy and tell me, well, Miss Shepherd, I had my blood drawn and they didn't do this and they didn't do that and they didn't do. I understand that there's a lot of people out there not doing the right thing. And when you don't do the right thing, it opens you up to errors. And then it opens you up to this type of situation. So if you are doing things the way you were taught, and you are making sure you properly introduce yourself, ID your patient, you're IDing the way you should, that if you catch anything that's off, you're reporting it, that you ask them to tell you their full name, you're asking them to tell you your date of birth, you're getting them to check your work behind you to make sure that you got the right labeling on that tube. If you're doing that, and a lot of people don't, then you're really cutting out the chance of you making this type of mistake that then you have to report, and you are running the risk of being reprimanded for it. Okay, here's another one. I'm not going to read this one for you, but I want you to stop, read this, and then see if you're answering it properly. Okay, so you should draw the time it was actually drawn at, right? So you were supposed to draw that time specimen at 12:05, right? You're at lunch and realize it's 12:25 p.m. When you draw the blood, what time should you record on that tube? 12:25 p.m., right? Okay? You do not want to lie about that because they're giving medicines based on that. Okay? We talked about those troughs and peaks, and that, you know, everybody, if they have kidney issues, they don't break these medicines down. And the last thing you want to do would give them more medicine when they have too much in their system to begin with. You could hurt their liver or kidneys. Or vice versa. they're very, very sick and they desperately need this medication to fight this infection or whatever. If they're not giving them enough of these antibiotics or medicines, then they're not getting the treatment that they need, which means they could get sicker, which means they could possibly die. So it's vitally important that you are honest when you're writing down the time that you draw these specimens. Okay? It's better just to admit your mistake than it is to, now you have two mistakes. Your first mistake was not paying attention to your time to make sure you could get that specimen drawn, or making sure someone got there at 12:05 to, someone else got there at 12:05 to draw it. And then the second mistake you would have made if you didn't label it properly was to lie and falsify records. Okay? Now, which one sounds worse? The fact that you just accidentally forgot because you were on lunch, or that you lied and falsified records? Which one sounds worse? Okay, so patients' rights. Okay, patients have what they call the Bill of Rights. Okay, and then they established this in 2003 as part of a patient care partnership, and it involves patients' rights to the following, and you see them listed down there. Okay, all members of the healthcare team recognize that their first responsibility is to the patient's health, safety, and personal dignity. Guys, make sure you understand that. It's every one of the members of the healthcare team. It's their responsibility, okay, to care about that patient's health, their safety, and their personal dignity, okay? And we have a lot of organizations out there like the American Hospital Association that have recognized rights for patients in healthcare organizations. The American Hospital Association, also known as the AHA, originally adopted a Patient's Bill of Rights in 1973, and our latest version that we're working on now was in 2003, as you see on the slide. It was titled, as you see on the slide, the Patient Care Partnership. And here lays out those key elements involving a patient's rights to the following, right? Quality health care. They have a right to high quality health care, okay? They have a right to clean and safe environment, right? We want to make sure, we're dealing with this with COVID-19 right now, right? We should make sure that if a patient's in a room, okay, that someone is keeping that room, anything on the floor picked up, trash changed out, keeping it sanitized, and when that patient is discharged, we want to make sure that somebody comes in there and thoroughly sanitizes and cleans that room before the next patient goes into it. And that is written in law that patients have a right to that, right? They have a right to be involved in their care. You remember we talked about health literacy. It's their right to know what's being done to them. It's their right to get a second opinion. It's their right and duty, really, to be involved in their health care. Always be involved in your health care. They have a right to privacy. If they're in there talking to their priest, if they're in their hospital room talking to their doctor, they have a right for you to wait until they get through talking to them privately before you come in and draw the blood. And we talked about examples of it being stat or timed, and then politely and respectfully inform both the doctor and the patient, and then it will be up to the physician and the patient as to whether they will halt their conversation, allow you to come in, respectfully draw their blood, leave, and then they can continue with their conversation. They have a right to the availability of assistance with leaving the hospital or with billing issues. We need these patients, when they are sent home, we should have a plan for them. We should dictate a plan for them so that when they get home, if they need home help, if they need some piece of durable medical equipment like oxygen or a hospital bed or a wheelchair, that we are helping coordinate that care. That's why we call it coordination of care. We want to make sure that not only does that patient have high quality health care when they're in that hospital, but that we lay them out with a plan with all the help they need when they get home, to make sure that they continue with their healing, to make sure they continue with getting better, so that they don't end up back in the hospital. Okay, we need to make sure that they go home with the prescriptions they need, or those prescriptions have been called in to a pharmacy and they know which pharmacy it is. And last but not least, a lot of this billing and insurance jargon and paperwork is very confusing, and we want to make sure that we provide them with assistance when it comes to that. So when we talk about governmental laws, right, we're talking about, we have three branches of government, right? We have the legislative branch. I cannot talk today, guys. Which involves your Senate, your Congress, right? They're the ones who craft those laws, okay? And then you have your executive branch. That's your president, right? Okay? And then you have your judicial branch, which is our courts, right? The Supreme Court and our other local and state judicial branches, okay? And these are the people that craft and make the laws, and then they control the laws, administer the laws, they all those kinds of things, right? So legislative written laws are called statutes, and they're made at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, okay? So here's some basic legal premises, okay? And so we need to know that decisions of the physician for centuries went unquestioned, right? If a doctor said, and I know a lot of y'all still have grandparents out there that think if the doctor told them that, it's the gospel, right? But this has changed because we know now that, yes, we need to listen to our healthcare providers, right? We need to listen to what our physicians say. But healthcare consumers, our patients, right? Those people that come into our clinics and our labs and our hospitals have become more aware of the fact that there's other healthcare options out there. They're much more critical of the care that they're giving. And unfortunately, they're much more willing to sue, even when healthcare workers are collecting their blood specimens, okay? So you need to have an understanding of the basic legal concepts so that you will know where you stand with this, because liability for the lack of proper standard of care may be imposed on any healthcare worker. So just to get some legal terminology down, and these questions in red will be on your study guide. Make sure you fill these out so you understand them. We have assault, okay? You need to know what that is. You know, you don't want to put your hands on another person, and you don't want another person putting their hands on you, right? In a violent or assaultive way. You have administrative law. We have what they call administrative law judges. They implement the ordinance through the executive branch. We have judicial law that functions to resolve disputes in accordance with the law. And then there's something called battery. That was the intentional touching of a person. Okay? So make sure you know these words and have those in there. And guys, follow along. We have a lot of really good information in our textbook. Okay, because our textbook talks about the legal terminology, right? And how important it is for you as a phlebotomist to understand it. Also, one of the things that it talks about in our textbook that isn't on this slide is neglect. Negligence, I'm sorry. So negligence is very important to healthcare providers, okay? Because in the past decade, the number of legal cases in which a laboratory has been directly or indirectly involved has increased noticeably, okay? Negligence is a violation of a duty to exercise reasonable skill and care in performing a task. So you're negligent. In other words, you didn't do it right? And you didn't take the time to do it right. It's one thing when you do all you can to do it right and something goes wrong, but they can find negligence in your behalf. For instance, say you have two outpatient labs in a big medical pavilion here in Shreveport, okay? And we have one on the first floor and one on the fourth floor. On the first floor, the phlebotomist working in that lab went to Bossier Parish Community College, okay? And they got the best training they could. And they were taught that they introduced themselves, they identified their patient, and they used their rec and something else to make sure that patient is being properly ID'd. They get them to state to them their full name and their date of birth. They do all that properly while they're IDing their patients. They don't have any problems in that lab on the first floor. No one's drawing blood from the wrong person. Things aren't getting reported out. Errors are low. On the fourth floor lab, there's a phlebotomist working there that went to another school where they didn't get nearly the amount of training that they needed, and they really just they don't understand, because they didn't get the information and education they needed to understand the importance of having that patient repeat the name and date of birth back to them. They think it's a waste of time, it's slowing the process down, and they need to hurry up and get this stuff done. So they cut corners. Well, one day, they don't ask that. This elderly gentleman couldn't hear well. He thought he heard the right name, but it wasn't. She drew the blood, and they diagnosed, monitored, and treated that patient off of lab results for another patient, and that patient was killed. They died. Now, their family filed suit, a wrongful death suit, and when they went back to find out, they found out that this phlebotomist was repeatedly being negligent in the way she identified her patient. She was not doing her job properly, and because of that, someone died. What do you think is going to happen to that phlebotomist? Okay, so make sure that you understand that word and what that word means. Make sure you understand torts are civil wrongs that include negligence and malpractice. And most civil lawsuits in the clinical laboratory are due to negligence that falls under the category of tort law, a private action taken between individuals. So I want to make sure you guys are aware of this, so that you will understand the reason I get you to do it this way. That rec prints out in that outpatient lab, and you tear it off, you look at it, you go out there and call your patient back, okay? You introduce yourself as you're walking him to the chair that you've already sanitized. Sorry for the noise, guys. You need to make sure that you ask them to tell you their full name and date of birth. And then you need to make sure that you're getting the right patient, because if not, criminal action could be taken against you. Okay? So don't just be negligent. Don't just be complacent. Don't just say, it's like I told you earlier about the method to the madness. You need to understand that these things are here for a reason. And one of the reasons is not just to protect that patient, but to protect you. So here's some other, it's our terminology that we want to use: defendant, false imprisonment, and felony, right? So make sure that you're going over these terms and you're understanding. You can pause them here. Usually the phlebotomist, you want to defend your position, right? So you would be the defendant. So make sure you're going over this legal terminology and that you understand what these words are, because these could be on a test, right? And luckily, y'all won't have test 6, but some of this could show up not only on your final, but going forward in your career when you take your ASCP, things like that. These are things you need to start studying now and make sure you know them, okay? So some more legal terminology. We have invasion of privacy, okay? That's the unauthorized release of information about a patient, which can get you in a lot of trouble. It can leave you liable, which is under legal obligation. Now you're liable for damages, okay? And then litigation process. That's a legal action to determine a decision in court. Many cases are negotiated and settled out of court, but you could still be liable if you invaded somebody's privacy and broke the confidentiality rules. Then there's malice, okay, and malpractice. You need to understand that malice is knowing a statement is false or making a statement with reckless disregard for the truth, okay? And malpractice is improper or unskilled care of a patient, such as the negligence that we talked about. Then we have a misdemeanor, right? All sorts of criminal offenses not serious enough to be classified as felonies. If found guilty, the defendant is usually fined and not put in prison. Okay? If you keep getting speeding tickets, That's a fine, right? That's something that's mild. Misdemeanor is usually something mild that you don't go to jail for. Misrepresentation. That's the use of misleading information or omission of important facts. Okay? That's just like you saying misrepresentation. If you look at that picture, does that centrifuge look like it's balanced? But you're going to say, of course we balance the centrifuge. That's a misrepresentation. Okay? So we talked about negligence and what that is. We had talked about a defendant earlier. Now we're talking a plaintiff, the complaint who brings the lawsuit, right? So the study tip for this is plaintiff is the person with the complaint, right? So the defendant is you're defending yourself. The plaintiff is the person complaining about something that you did. Res esse locara is the doctrine that it stands for the thing speaks for itself. And it's applied when the plaintiff is injured in such a way that he or she cannot prove how it occurred. This usually is applied when the injured party was in surgery, unconscious, or was an infant. So if something happened to that infant that caused them to be injured, okay, we call that thing speaks for itself, because that infant, of course, cannot tell us what happened. We have to let the situation itself speak for itself. And if the person was in surgery and somebody left a tool in them, okay, and later on they were injured and they had to go back into surgery and have it removed and things went wrong, they can't tell you what happened because they weren't awake to see it happen, but it speaks for itself, okay? And guys, make sure you're following along on all this legal terminology. And I know this is a lot of words and go through it, but you really need to know what these words mean, okay? There is lots of them. If you look on page 88 and 89, it goes through all these terms one by one, okay? It talks about malpractice, okay? It talks about damages, everything like this, okay? So, respondent superior. That's the action of one person's or imputed to another having control. So, under this concept, supervisors and directors may be held liable for the neglect and actions of their employees. So that's why you've got to understand that your supervisor, if they find out you're repeatedly doing things wrong, a lot of times that's why they want to write you up, get on to you, and maybe even fire you, because what you're doing not only affects that patient and you, but it affects them as well. So if you become a lead phlebotomist, if you become a phlebotomy supervisor, you need to take into consideration that you could get dragged into this too if you are allowing people under you to continue to make these mistakes. Also, make sure that if you are witness to another healthcare worker doing something that you know is illegal, wrong, immoral, then you need to speak up and let your supervisor know. This isn't about being a tattletale. This is about doing the right thing and stopping someone from hurting another person, okay? Then we have subpoenas, right? Those are court orders for persons and documents to be brought to court proceedings, right? We talked about tort and what that was, right? Okay, negligence, it goes on around, but we're talking more about this negligence, okay? So these are factors that may be considered in a negligent case, right? Duty, okay? It relates to what duties or responsibilities the hospital or healthcare worker had towards the patient and that they used the appropriate standard of care. And the picture says, I should follow up on this child heart murmur, but I'm too busy. That's not something you can do, right? That makes sense. And you would think that things don't happen like this, but they do. So we have to make sure it's your duty. And like I said, if you see somebody else doing something wrong, it is your duty to speak up, okay? We're not children on the playground, okay? This isn't about ratting out one of your friends or whatever. This is your duty as a healthcare professional to report things that you see when it is obvious somebody is doing something that could harm the patient and the facility. Plus, this is the place you work. Do you really want that place sued? That's gonna harm your job security, your ability to get raises, and all kinds of stuff. Besides, just think if this was your family member, wouldn't you want someone to speak up for your family member? Then there's breach of duty. Okay, this relates to whether the duty was breached and if it were avoidable. The plaintiff must show, and remember, you got to understand who the plaintiff is, complaint, right? Must show what actually happened and that the defendant acted unreasonably. Okay, so our little cartoon here is you see a nurse, and the nurse says, I wonder if this is the right pill. Yesterday, it was yellow. Okay, now, if you say that in front of a patient, for sure, you need to make sure that you don't give them that pill, right? You go back out, you call down to the pharmacy, you make sure that it's all fine. That's why I don't know if any guys ever noticed it, but sometimes when if you have a prescription that you're getting, or if your parents or your grandparents have a prescription for your child, and it's something they're on, if they're on some thyroid medicine or diabetic medicine, cholesterol medicine, if the pharmacist knows that this pill is usually white, and all of a sudden they change manufacturers or something happens and now it's yellow, they are going to put something on your prescription bottle and your paperwork telling you. But if they're really good at their job, as they're handing it to you, what are they going to do? They're face-to-face going to look you in your eye and say, Miss Shepherd, that blood pressure medicine that you normally take, I know it's always white, but we put it on your paperwork, but I just want to tell you too, they've changed it to yellow now, but it is the correct medicine. Okay? In breach of duty is if she gave that pill to that, she knew that it didn't look right, but she gave it to him anyway instead of taking the time to go check with the pharmacist and make sure that it's right. And I know that takes time and we're all busy, and I know they put a lot of stress on us for turnaround time, but no one wants you to cut corners in doing your job appropriately. You take those few seconds or few minutes you need to go verify that that's the right thing before you do anything to your patient. So foreseeability, that relates to the concept that certain events may reasonably be expected to cause specific results. Okay, an example of this is using a long, large needle to collect blood from an elderly patient will lead to vein damage and hematoma. So we know this, right? And then proximate causation relates to whether the breach of duty actually contributed to or caused the injury. It must be proven in a case of neglect. Like this guy, he works in a very, obviously he works on a construction site. He has a construction helmet on. He has glasses on and a vest so he can be seen. He's doing manual labor, right? Did the hematoma on his arm come from being stuck by a phlebotomist, or was it something on his job that he was doing? Okay? And we need to be sure. In foreseeable, you can see that what you're doing could cause harm, right? We know that doing that could cause a problem, right? And we need to foresee that and not do it, okay? Injury or harm, okay? When we talk about the demonstration that an actual physical injury occurred, okay, which is a picture of the hematoma, something like that, right? Damages relates to whether the plaintiff complaint, right, was actually injured and when these injuries were disclosed. That's why we talked about if you accidentally stick yourself with a needle on the job, you have a procedure that you fill out. First thing you're going to do is immediately go and flush that wound out, right? And then what are you going to do? Right after that, you're going to report it to your supervisor. You're going to fill out an incident report, and then you're going to go down and have your medical stuff done either at a work care or down in the emergency room because you want it documented. Because if 3 or 6 months down the road, you develop some issue dealing with that, if you didn't have it documented, there's no way to know if you contracted that issue in the healthcare setting or in your work setting or if it was out somewhere else, right? So healthcare workers collected blood from a patient, right? This is an example, okay? The needle went through the vein and into the median nerve. The healthcare worker continued attempting to get the blood despite the patient's complaints, and the patient subsequently lost the use of 3 fingers in his hand due to nerve damage, okay? Now, that patient would need to report you to the supervisor is what they would do. If you were a phlebotomist, if the patient kept saying, oh, it's numb and it's hurting, and you didn't immediately pop that tourniquet, get that needle out of their arm, and you kept doing that and it caused nerve damage, they could report you. They'd fill out an incident report, record the injury and when it happened, so that 3 or 4 days later, when he lost use of those 3 fingers, they could tie that directly back to you and prove negligence in court that it happened. So if you have an incident where, you hit the vein, you want to immediately get out of there, okay? Because most of the time, it doesn't lead to the loss of use in 3 fingers. It just doesn't. But if you hit that nerve, and that's why it's so important, I teach you guys not to go too deep with that vein, to visualize your vein, okay? You feel them with touch, not sight, right? And that these are minor, small movements, and we never dig it around an arm, because you're getting the education and information that you need to avoid these things from happening. And if you do what you're taught and what you know is right, then you can avoid this to begin with. Okay? And all those other people you see out there not following these rules, not doing the things that I have taught you that you need to do, those are just the people that will have things like this to happen. And then they'll think, well, it has nothing to do with me. They can sue the hospital. No, they can sue you too. Okay? So make sure you're aware of that. So talking about malpractice or professional negligence is the improper, unskilled care of a patient by a member of a healthcare professional, misconduct, or unreasonable lack of skill. Like a physician who performs too many C-sections will be and should be investigated. Okay? If you have a doctor who's had too many infections in his patients after surgery, things of this nature, these are things that we try to track, and we want to go back and investigate to make sure that maybe that somebody in there is not washing their hands properly. This is how we catch problems before they lead to deaths. Okay? So HIPAA, right? The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This requires that healthcare providers obtain a patient's written consent before disclosing medical information for routine uses, such as diagnosis, treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. So this includes the electronic transfer of medical information, even of fax if that's the case. Okay? And the medical information is referred to as protected health information. So what this boils down to is when you go to the doctor, you're given a form that explains to you about HIPAA. Now, something I don't like is I don't like it when they ask you if you understand or not. Because, again, we talked about this in our communication, right? A lot of people read this paper, they really don't understand. So the person giving them that information needs to look at them and say, I need you to read this. If you have any questions, please let me know. It's important to you that you read it because this determines how we handle your medical information. And who's ever giving that HIPAA information to them needs to let them ask the questions, and they need to be trained on how to properly answer those questions so that patient is in that loop, right? That information is given to them, they receive it, you get the feedback to understand that they understand what they're signing. Okay, so then you sign a form saying that it's okay if you have to go to a specialist. Let's just say you go in and you're having your mammogram done and then you need to go to a breast specialist. You want to make sure that you have gave them consent to send your medical records over to this breast specialist, right? To send it to Blue Cross and Blue Shield, because Blue Cross and Blue Shield is your insurance and they're going to decide to make payments, right? To send it over to the pharmacy so the pharmacy can fill your prescription and bill your insurance for your medicine, right? You want this information to be sent to people that need it, but you only want it sent to people who need it and not just anyone. And that's what HIPAA is about. You don't want to just let any healthcare worker be able to pull up your medical records. And now, even doctors cannot just pull up any patient's medical record. If they don't have a reason, if they're not either that doctor's primary physician or they're a specialist that's working on their case, or they've been called in to work on this patient's case by somebody, and they go in and look at, they could get in trouble for looking at other patients' medical records. Same thing with phlebotomists. If you're going in and viewing people's medical records, first of all, you probably won't even be able to get to them, okay? But if you were and you didn't have a direct reason for getting in there, you could be reprimanded, possibly written up, possibly action taken against you, maybe even fired, because you're not to be doing anything in anybody's medical records that you don't need to be in there for. And we talk about negligence, and earlier we've been talking about things that you do wrong, whether it's something you actually do, whether it's digging around in a patient's arm with a needle, or not holding pressure long enough and causing a huge hematoma, not securing your patient in the chair and they fall out and hit their head when they pass out, not properly identifying your patient and then they get the wrong unit of blood and have kidney damage. That's the negligence and malpractice we've been talking about up to now. Now, as I explained HIPAA to y'all, we're now talking about negligence involving patient confidentiality. When you disclose information on a patient when you're not supposed to, it's prohibited by law, and it can cause a negligence case brought against you. No one except the patient may release patient results without a clinical need to know. We talked about that. Even a doctor doesn't need to be looking at a patient's lab results, patient's medical records, unless they're working with or on that patient's case. Okay? Confidential material include communications between the physician and the patient's verbal statements, computer entries on that patient, and nonverbal communications such as laboratory test results having to do with alcohol abuse, HIV, etc. Right? So this little cartoon shows, it says, when I drew blood this morning, I overheard the nurse saying he may have cancer. Okay? You don't want to be out discussing this in the cafeteria, in the hallway. Okay? Because you don't know who that is coming down the hall. You don't know who's standing next to you in the elevator, who's sitting 2 seats over from you in the cafeteria. And because of what you're saying, they're able to put it together that that's their mother or brother or child. And they're going to turn you in and you're going to get in trouble. And they could file suit against the hospital and file suit directly against you. So when we're talking about HIV exposure, there's stigmas associated with HIV and AIDS, sadly. And so in some states, they had to come up with laws to allow the healthcare workers to know the identity of patients who have AIDS or is HIV positive. Louisiana law allows you to know. So you can know if the patient you are sticking has HIV and AIDS. I'm going to go ahead and give you my thoughts on it. I don't really agree with this because, first and foremost, we should be treating all patients with standard precautions, universal precautions. Everything should be under standard and universal precautions, right? Okay? You should be using every safety feature you can, every safety procedure that you can to make sure, like I told you, when you're doing capillary sticks, when you're doing skin puncture, once you puncture that skin, you count 1, 2, and you take that lancet away. Where does that lancet go? Directly in the sharps container, right? You have your pile separate. You wear your lab coat. It's buttoned up in the front. You wear closed-toed shoes. You wear your gloves. If you're dealing with, when we were talking about specimen processing, you want to be behind that shield. You want to have a face shield on, right? Because you want to treat every patient like they could have HIV. You want to treat every patient from the 1-year-old to the 100-year-old like they could have hepatitis, HIV, okay? There's other stuff out there that kills us, okay, that we could get, bacteria, virus, parasites. So instead of, telling people, I just think we need to treat everybody that way. And if we're following all the safety policies and procedures, using all the safety equipment that we can in the correct way, then it won't matter, okay? So I just believe that's a breach of people's confidentiality. Now, having said that, if you are accidentally exposed, whether it be through a skin puncture with a needle, somebody bumps into you and the needle goes into your hand or finger, if something were to happen and blood were to spray and it got in your eye or something like that, then when you go to file your incident report, when you tell your supervisor and y'all are filling out the report and you go down to the emergency room, over to work care to have your medical stuff done, then yes, if they know, then there's extra precautions they need to take with you, extra things that needs to be done with you. If they don't know if that patient is HIV or hepatitis positive, they're going to run tests on that patient to see, so they'll know the extent of medical care you as a healthcare worker needs. Okay, but you do need to know that Louisiana law allows you to know who are the patients who are HIV positive. And they allow you to know, but what does that mean? That means that's confidential information that you have. And if they find out that you breached that patient's confidentiality because you told other people that he was HIV or she was HIV positive, that can lead you not only to being fired, it could lead you to having a black stain on your record, and other places may not want to hire you because of it, and it could put you in a position where you could be sued, dragged into court, and you could be paying someone. Okay? So here's one of our critical thinking slides. Analyze the situation. Pause this video, okay? Read over it and see if you can answer it correctly. Again, this is back to my thoughts on this, okay? This is why I harp on proper PPE, washing your hands, blunting your lab coat, the shoes you should wear, the lengths you should go to keep yourself safe so you don't get sick, so that you don't spread infection from one patient to the other, and so you don't take bacteria, viruses, diseases, and anything home to your family. Okay? You treat everybody with standard and universal precautions. Everybody and everything. Okay, here's another question for you. I think it makes you careless. I just agree with that. I think if we go out there and we are very diligent in making sure we wash our hands, apply our gloves, our lab coat is buttoned up, we're wearing the right shoes, we're always wearing the appropriate PPE, that we're cleaning our supplies, that we're cleaning things, that we are treating everyone and everything as though they could possibly be infectious. And we're using every safety procedure and policy that we can, every piece of equipment that we can to keep us safe, and using them properly in the correct way, then it just leads to less chance that we infect ourselves, that we take that infection from one patient to the next, and that we don't take it home. We're trying to avoid that, right? Not only do we not want to take a bacterial or a viral infection from one patient's room to another, okay? We also don't want to give ourselves something. We don't want something that we have to be given to our patients, and we definitely don't want to bring it home to our children and our husbands and wives, right? So confidentiality and HIV exposure. So what should you do if you have an exposure incident? We've been through this, right? We've been through this many times in class, okay? So there's the home health care. This is talking about home health care. It's pretty much the same procedure, right? Okay? So pause this slide and read over this, okay? Make sure you understand about the confidentiality and HIV exposure, okay? And also on page 91 of chapter 3, there it talks about confidentiality and HIV exposures, okay? So make sure you read that in your textbook as well, okay? So standard of care. If a patient has suffered injury resulting from blood collection for laboratory testing, the patient must show that the healthcare worker who collected the blood failed to meet the prevailing standard of care, right? So what are 5 ways standard of care can be established? There's statutes, right? Laws, statutes. There's licensing requirements, rules and regulations for the professional organization itself, internal healthcare facilities, rules, regulations, policies and procedures, and professional publications. Now moving on to informed consent, and that's all that information is on page 92 of your textbook. Okay? Okay, informed consent means voluntary permission by a patient to allow touching, examination, and or treatment by healthcare providers. So what you're doing is you're telling them what you're going to do to them, and they are giving you permission to do it, right? Minors must have the informed consent of a parent, and unconscious patients must have the closest relative to them give the okay for the care. An adult with the mental capacity of a child must have their appointed guardian give the informed consent, and those with foreign languages must have an interpreter before they can give informed consent. Most states require before HIV blood collection and testing. So extending an arm or rolling up a sleeve is considered informed consent. But that's why I train y'all also to say, hey, I'm Melissa, I'm from the lab, I'm here to draw your blood. Okay, because you're telling them who you are, where you're from, and what you're there for. They have a right to say, I don't want my blood drawn. Now, what I do is take a deep breath, right, because I try to stay calm, okay? And in a very cool and calm, confident tone, I say, well, Miss Smith, you know, your doctor ordered this, and he really needs these lab results to help take care of you and make sure he can get you better so you can go home. It'd really be helpful if you would allow me to draw this blood so we can get your lab results to your doctor. Are you sure you don't want to let me draw your blood? Sometimes they will go on. If they don't, then it's their right to refuse, and you go back out and let the nurse know. And then you let your supervisor know, and it's documented, right? Okay, so remember, when you walk out, when you're in their outpatient lab and the rec prints out and you peel it off and you call Miss Johnson to the back, right? And you say, hey, Miss Johnson, my name's Melissa. I'm going to be drawing your blood today. Can you tell me your full name and date of birth? And they have a seat. This whole time, you've told them what they're there for, right? And then you put them in the seat and you say, which arm do you usually like to have your blood drawn out of? When they extend that arm out to you, that left arm or that right arm, and they start getting it so that you can look for that vein, that's informed consent. They're informed on what's going on, and they are voluntarily giving you permission to go ahead and do it. Okay, now that's different. Informed consent to have a catheter placed in, informed consent to have drugs administered, informed consent to have blood drawn, that's completely different than informed consent for research purposes. Because of some very unethical treatment of not just, we hear about unethical treatment of animals, but of humans in the past. Talking about that Tuskegee experiment, and there's others. Laws were passed which established what we refer to as the IRB, which is the Institutional Research Board. And that board is there to review and approve research proposals. So in other words, I work at Bossier Parish Community College, and I want to do a research project on a set of students at school to see about their learning process and how they learn. I would have to send a proposal to our BIPSI's IRB, and we have an IRB. They would look over my proposal, and then they would decide whether they would allow me to proceed with this research or not. Also, now in research, I would have to show them a copy of the informed consent that I was going to hand out to the students. Okay? If I was giving them a survey, I would have to have a copy of the survey I was going to give to the students in my proposal package, right? Because I need to include full disclosure about what I'm doing and what tools I'm using to do it, which explains the full nature of the research and the risk involved. So if I were to be doing some type of research where we were doing a drug trial, right? There's a new drug on the market, okay? Just like we hear about all these drugs that they're testing and doing research on for COVID-19. Okay, guys, here's the deal. This drug may have worked well for malaria. It may have worked well for Ebola. And yes, in a crisis situation where people are dying, we need to be doing research to see if these drugs also may provide some help to our patients dying of COVID-19. But before we're able to do this research, we need to inform that patient, hey, here is this drug. It's been really successful on malaria. We're not sure. Here's all the stuff that could happen that could help you. Here are the risks that are involved. Y'all hear those commercials all the time for these new medicines that are out on the market, and they'll say may cause this, may cause this, may cause this. They have to tell people what are the risks involved with taking that medication. We need to make sure these people understand it, and also we have to prove that they understand it, which means they're in that communication loop, right? Which means you tell them about it. You make sure that they fully understand it. They give you feedback to make sure they understand it. And then they sign off, right? Saying that they understand that, hey, yes, this may hurt me here, here, and here, but this also may save my life. So I want to be a part of this research to prove that this drug does or does not work for this particular illness, okay? So that's kind of how that stuff works. But it has to be informed consent, and it has to be full disclosure. Okay, you can't just tell them, hey, this drug may save your life, but not tell them all the risk involved and all the things that could go wrong. They have a right to know. Okay, so then there's implied consent, right? This exists when immediate action is required to save a patient's life or prevent permanent impairment of the patient's health. Implied, right? Think about it. And that's there's a bigger definition of implied consent on page 93 of your textbook. Couple of things with this. Emergencies remove the need for informed consent, right? Because what you're going to say is the essence behind implied consent is that if the person was able to do so, they would have agreed to treatment by signing an informed consent, right? Because they don't want you to just let them die, right? So the implied consent is if they are in an emergency situation, and if you don't do something right now, they could lose their leg, or they could lose their arm, or their life, right? It is implied that this person would want you to save their leg or save their life, right? And so, but the requirements for implied consent differ legally from one state to another. So healthcare providers need to know the legal boundaries of implied consent, because someday they may need to decide whether to perform a vital emergency procedure, such as CPR, right? So, in other words, what we're telling you is implied consent says that if you come up on a person who is unconscious and dying, and if you don't do something as a healthcare worker, they could die, that it's implied that they want you to save their life. So you do not have to get informed consent from them to perform CPR. But also, if you are living and working in the state of Louisiana, please make sure you know the applicable laws or boundaries on what you can and cannot do when it comes to implied consent. Make sure you know the difference, okay? Make sure you know the difference between implied consent and informed consent. All right, you may have heard this before, a statute of limitations, right? This is a law that defines how soon after an injury a plaintiff must file the lawsuit or be forever barred from doing so. In Louisiana, as in most states, the statute of limitation is 2 years. So if you go in and you have your blood drawn and they hit a nerve, and the phlebotomist immediately gets the needle, pops the tourniquet, gets the needle out and all that, and there doesn't appear right then, there's some numbness and tingling, but there doesn't appear to be an injury, right? What happens is that phlebotomist has X amount of time, okay? I mean, that plaintiff, that patient has 2 years to file suit. Because typically within that 2-year period, if there's going to be some damage, it's going to show up within the first 6 months to a year, right? So if after 2 years, no damage is shown up, then your statute of limitation runs out, which means you cannot then sue somebody for something that happens. And if you think about this, this makes sense, right? Because after 2 years, if there's a problem, it's going to show itself, right, within 2 years. After that, you never know when something else, they had blood drawn again, they were in a car accident, they fell down the stairs, any other number of things could have happened to them in their life after 2 years that could have caused the damage, and it's not the damage that ensued from the venipuncture. So again, knowing your state laws is important, okay? So we're going to talk about some things. In a malpractice lawsuit, the first statement of a case by the plaintiff against the defendant is the complaint, right? So that's the first thing they do. They file a complaint. In states, a cause of action is notifying the defendant of the reason for the lawsuit, okay? They have to tell the defendant why you're being sued. What is the reason? So steps of beginning a malpractice lawsuit, and you guys need to understand this because this could happen, okay? The parties to a lawsuit have the right to discovery. And I know y'all watch legal shows on TV, right? So they have a right to examine the witnesses before the trial, and they have a right for them to send over whatever documentation, whatever pictures, whatever evidence they have against the defendant. They have to send all that evidence over so that your lawyer can look over all that evidence, be able to examine the witnesses before the trial so they can get everything together. Discovery consists of oral testimony under oath and includes cross-examination by the lawyers. So study tip, you want to discover what they know, right? Then you have depositions, right? That's the testimony of a witness that has been recorded in a written legal format. Okay, and the parties may undergo cross-examination, providing testimony regarding the cause for the case that will be recorded and filed. And a lot of times they bring out those expert witnesses, right? They're expert in the field that may be used to assist a plaintiff in proving the wrongful act of a defendant or assist the defendant in refuting such evidence. Okay, so you might bring in a phlebotomy supervisor that has been a phlebotomist for 50 years. You might bring in a clinical laboratory scientist that has a master's degree that teaches phlebotomy. And so they are an expert witness, okay? They teach phlebotomy, so they're an expert on it, and they can either assist the plaintiff in proving that the phlebotomist didn't do their job right, which led to the negligence, or they can assist the phlebotomist and the defendant in refuting the evidence, saying, no, that's not true, they did the things correctly, right? Then, of course, there's evidence, right? It's used to prove or disprove the lawsuit and includes such items as vacutainer tubes, tube holders, needles, safety apparatuses, infection control logs, reports, things of that nature, right? And then we have, some people already have things made up in their mind, right? We know this before they even get the evidence, right? So in about 51%, okay, this term implies that the defendant must then likely committed the act. A preordinance of the evidence means that all that evidence is in there, right? And that it's a lot like that, a reasonable doubt kind of thing, right? The preordinance of the evidence is a majority. And we know that 50-50 is not a majority, right? So 51%. This term, is talking about the defendant more than likely committed that act, okay? So if 55% of the evidence shows, then that is over on the part that says they likely committed that act, right? If that makes sense. And again, guys, anytime during these slides, if I run across something I'm not explaining it well, or you don't understand what I'm saying, please feel free to reach out to me. Also, make sure you're using your textbook because it goes through all these terms. And I know this is a lot of terms and a lot of words and stuff like that, but you need to know these terms and what they mean as related to your job, okay? So So here's some lawsuit prevention tips for minimizing your risk as a phlebotomist and a healthcare worker, right? So justice is expensive. Lawyers' fees typically range from $200 to $700 an hour, and you do not want to have to pay that, right? They're not paying any of us enough for all that, right? So what do we want to do? I want to train you, educate you, and inform you on how to do your job the right way, and I want to give you tips on things that you can do to minimize your risk. First and foremost, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen, right? Always document time, dates. Always make sure blood collector's initials are on there, okay? Make sure all your stuff is labeled and documented properly, right? You want to always follow your healthcare facility's policies and procedures. And if you must deviate from those policy procedures, discuss it with your immediate supervisor first. You want to ensure patient safety always. You want to monitor those patients before and after blood collection. That's why I tell you, right? Remember when we talk about it, we set them down in that seat. First of all, what do? We make sure we wash our hands. We make sure we put on clean gloves, right? That's your patient, ensuring your patient's safety, right? We clean our chair. And I know y'all have seen it before. I know y'all have been in those labs, standing in there, and they are not sanitizing between that where they put their arm on between patients. And I hope COVID-19 has made y'all realize that there needs to be wipes there. There needs to be 10% bleach spray there. And between every single patient, you need to wipe that chair down. Now, as I tell y'all in class, where your behind goes and where your back goes, the seat that they sit in, no, because they're blocking that, right? But the arm, where they put their arm, where it goes in front of there, that stuff needs to be wiped down between each and every patient, right? Okay? Y'all need to make sure that you're not leaving the tourniquet on too long, right? All the things, introducing yourself, IDing your patient, doing your medical interview, cleaning the chair, all these things, locking them in. Remember how I told you lock them in? Remember how I told you that as you're drawing the blood, keep an eye on your patient. If they start sweating, if their face turns pale, if they complain that it's hurting, pop that tourniquet, get that needle out, right? If they're having a seizure, get them down on the ground, make sure that they can't hit their head or something against anything. These are all things that you can do to minimize the risk to your patient, which minimizes the lawsuit risk to you. Because why? Because it means you're doing the things that you are trained and know to do that are right, okay? You always return those bed rails to the previous position, and I know y'all heard me tell you this. I remember this in my lecture one day. I said, if you can't remember if they were up or down, put them up, okay? You always want to lock those patients in that blood collection chair. If a patient says they feel faint, feel like they're going to throw up, you want to get them in a good position and monitor them for 20 minutes later. And what do I always tell you guys? Okay? We don't put Band-Aids on little kids that can put it in their mouth because they could choke on it. Something we don't do, right? We hold pressure for the amount of time that needs to be held pressure for. And what do we say to them? Okay? Hey, leave this on here for about 15 minutes. After about 15 minutes, if it's not bleeding anymore, you can take it off. Try not to lift anything with this arm for about an hour. Why are we doing that? Because we're doing our job, guys. We're communicating these things to our patient to keep our patient safe. Safe right then when they're with us and safe after they go home. Okay? And I'm telling you right now, if you don't do these things that you've been trained to do, that every healthcare worker knows, even if they're not doing it, they should do them. You are running the risk to have your patient hurt, which then in turn would open you up to a lawsuit. Okay, so give proper treatment. Use proper techniques and equipment, okay? Update skills through your CEWs. You always want to stay up to date on the latest safety techniques, latest safety devices. You always want to stay informed and educated, always, right? You want to monitor and report. You want to report any significant changes in a patient's condition. That's like I told you before. If they don't stop bleeding because they're on Coumadin or heparin therapy, or they're on some other medication that causes them not to clot, you never leave them bleeding, right? You go and let someone know. If you have to leave and go to another patient, you let that nurse know so that they can come in there and take care of that patient. Equipment use. Use correct waste containers, even when off-site. Always use the correct containers, okay? So not only with that equipment, right? Not only do you need to make sure you use the correct waste containers, even if you're working in home health or if you're going to someone's house to draw blood, you know, you also want to make sure with HIV, people with known HIV. Again, though, it's my pet peeve. We treat everything and everybody with universal and standard precautions, right? But do not discriminate in treatment. You want to be aware of the possibility of nosocomial transmissions, right? Which means, right, we've discussed this before, we know what nosocomial infections are, and we do not want to contribute to that, okay? We do not want to be spreading one infection from one patient's room into another, and that boils down to changing your gloves, making sure you're cleaning off your equipment, making sure that you're washing your hands, and never ever breach the confidentiality of any patient for any reason, especially someone with something like HIV. We talked earlier about respondent superior, right? Which is a Latin term meaning let the master answer, and is the legal doctrine that holds employees responsible for acts of their employees, okay? Not only can the injured party sue the employee, as in you, the phlebotomist, but the employer, as in Willis Knight and Ochsner's, as in your laboratory supervisor, your phlebotomy supervisor. If sued, they may seek indemnification, which is a compensation for financial loss suffered from the employee's act. Okay? So make sure you understand you could have people coming at you from every corner, having your paycheck garnished to pay back your former employer and that patient, right? And we do not want this, okay? So make sure you're following along page 95. It highlights your whole expert witness, your evidence, your advice to avoid lawsuits, and respondent superior, right? So in many cases, the healthcare institution negotiates and settles out of court. They have an arbitrator that comes in, and that person mediates the thing between the defendant and the plaintiff, and they settles out of court. But this still could lead to financial action taken against you. So cases resulting from improper technique and negligence, okay? These are some problems that we've seen that leads to phlebotomy lawsuits. First of all, hematomas. Sorry about the dogs, guys. So for inadequate pressure to the vein, right? It's not hematomas. Some people just get hematomas, especially older people with thinner skin. You do everything perfect, and they still get a hematoma. We're talking about where they can prove neglect, which is you didn't hold pressure like you were supposed to. You didn't put your Coban on them. You didn't talk to them about holding pressure. You didn't do your medical interview. All these things, and it caused a hematoma like you see in this picture up above, which you know is horrible. And neglect caused that, or improper technique. Infection at the venipuncture site, okay? Again, injuries from fainting, falling before, during, or after blood collection because you did not use proper technique. You didn't pop that tourniquet, you didn't get the vein out, you didn't secure them in the chair to begin with. You knew they were dizzy, they complained about being dizzy, they complained about being nauseous, and you just let them walk out of there without doing the things that you know you're supposed to do. They fainted, and you didn't make them stay there for the allotted amount of time. You let them walk out, and they fainted again and busted their head open. Okay? Nerve damage from poor technique, from digging around in there when you're not supposed to, from shoving a needle too far into the arm. And we train you in lab. I've talked to y'all about this. That needle does not need to go in very far, right? We saw this when we were drawing blood. There's also complications from drawing blood from the same site as a mastectomy. We train you on this stuff. So if we're training you on this and we're telling you that it is improper technique to do this and you do it anyway and harm that patient, that's negligence, okay? Identification errors leading to the wrong diagnosis, the wrong treatment, and sometimes even death. And that comes from improper technique. I've told you about introducing yourself, properly IDing your patient. And I go over it and over it and over it. And an expert witness like myself would be called in to testify that you are trained. Textbooks would be used, PowerPoint presentations would be used to show that you have been trained over and over and over again on what you're supposed to do to properly ID your patient. This is why when y'all tell me, well, they don't do that when I went and got blood drawn, I don't care what they didn't do. They did it wrong. They're using improper technique. And if it leads to an identification error, it could lead to neglect, which means they could be fired and sued. So here's some true lawsuits that's happened, okay? So a healthcare worker unskilled in phlebotomy, okay? In other words, they weren't a trained, certified, licensed phlebotomist, right? Inserted a needle 2 inches above the ana cubita fossa of the arm, okay? The needle went through the vein, through the muscle, and into a nerve, severely damaging the patient's arm. The patient sustained permanent injury and impaired use of that arm even after 3 surgeries to repair the damage. This is why when I hear people say, well, I can train anybody to be a phlebotomist. That's not true. This is a profession. It's a serious profession. It is a vital part of, you are a vital part of the healthcare team. And the job that you do is important, and it could lead to the damage of a patient if you're not doing it right. Now, I'm not saying this to scare you. You guys have had the information and education and training that you need, and you will continue to get that information, education, and training as you go through this program here at BIPSI, to where when you go out there and work as a phlebotomist, you will know what to do and what not to do to avoid injuries. So here's another example of phlebotomist under pressure to collect specimen in an outpatient clinic as quickly as possible, drew blood in a sitting position even after the patient warned the healthcare worker that he fainted in the past. After releasing the patient immediately, he fainted at the elevator and suffered a permanent loss of smell and had a constant ringing in his ears as a result of the fall. Okay? So I understand that turnaround times are important. And there's a difference between, you know, I jokingly tell y'all, don't lollygag and let's hurry, 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 get it done, get it done. But remember what I always say, you have to be able to do it correctly, appropriately, efficiently, and effectively, and quickly at the same time. Y'all know what I'm talking about. You've seen those people at the grocery store or Circle K or anywhere. They're not interested in being there for their job. They're moving like a snail. You're waiting in line, the line's backed up. They could get in more of a hurry than what they are so that they could provide good customer service and get that line moving and still be able to do their job very correctly. Same thing with you. You can do your job correctly and still be able to do it as quickly as possible as long as you're doing it correctly. Do not let anybody pressure you into doing something that you know is wrong. So a phlebotomist collecting bedside glucose results caused the death of 3 patients with diabetes. The glucose values she reported were inaccurate, causing the doctor to prescribe the wrong amount of insulin. The error may have been avoided by better training, supervision, and proper running of QC. Guys, we have to run QC on these bedside instruments, right? Every 8-hour shifts, 2 levels of control. Usually we use a low and a high. Why? Because we want to make sure that that instrument is working properly. It can catch really low glucose results and it can catch really high glucose results. You have to have the proper training. You have to keep up with any changes if they get a new instrument. You also need to be supervised in the beginning to make sure you're doing it right. And you need to be running QC. And if that QC does not work, you have to troubleshoot it and figure out what it is, run controls again, and they must come in for you to use that instrument on a patient. Another example. A phlebotomist used an excessive angle of the needle, inserting it into the basilic vein, when the median cutal vein was an obviously better option for collection. The improper collection resulted in injury to the patient's median nerve. The patient was awarded thousands of dollars for the healthcare worker's violation regarding proper standard of care. So even though I say to you, the median cubital vein is the best option, and when that option is there and that patient has a good vein, and you just completely ignore that for whatever reason and stick some other vein and something goes wrong, you have not taken the proper standard of care, and you can be found liable for that. So in other words, when you tie that vein around that patient's arm, you're going to always look for that median cubital vein first. And if it is there and it is a good vein, you're going to always stick that first. You only go to these other veins. You only move to the dorsal on the hand when you can't find a good median cubital vein to draw blood from. Okay, looking at HIV-related issues here, okay, so if a healthcare worker becomes infected with HIV during employment, the healthcare worker must demonstrate a connection between his HIV infection and employment, right? And sometimes they will evaluate that healthcare worker's lifestyle to evaluate whether there is a connection or if you sustain this infection outside the hospital. That's why I told you it's vitally important that if you accidentally stick yourself with a needle, whether that patient does or does not have HIV, okay, if you get blood in your eyes, anything that happens, you always want to follow that procedure from flushing that area out properly all the way down to notifying your supervisor, filling out an incident report, and going to the emergency room or the work care facility to be taken care of, okay? Healthcare workers cannot be resigned because of contracting AIDS. Unemployed benefits may be available if the healthcare worker can show that continued employment would jeopardize their health. So types of malpractice insurance. You have a blanket malpractice insurance, just as it says. It covers the worker in the hospital and the laboratory, kind of blankets over it. Pathologist malpractice insurance, usually the lowest because he has so little patient contact. Most phlebotomists working in the hospital are covered by this type of insurance. And individual malpractice insurance usually covers attorney's fees and court costs. Seven factors that must be considered when purchasing your own malpractice insurance. Does your employer carry insurance? Okay, that's what the first thing you want to know is. If something happens on the job and you're doing your job correctly, and because people sue sometimes when it's not even your fault, right? But if you know that you're following your health care, you're following all the laws, that you are ethically doing the right thing, that you're following your healthcare facilities policy and procedure to the dime, that you're delivering that standard of care, you're doing everything to keep your patient safe, and then you want to make sure your employer has that insurance that's covering you as one of their employees, which most of them do. But you also want to realize that the hospital and or the pathologist may not always have your best interest in mind. They may be worried more about themselves than they are you. So it's adequate dollar coverage. You know, if you're going to look at things that you want to do to maybe protect yourself, these are things you need to look at. You know, find out if that's adequate dollar coverage, okay? What are the limitations for this insurance? What procedures must be followed to receive coverage? And are specimens collected off-site covered? Okay, so you just want to look into these things and make sure that you understand, you know, what's going on in your situation. Okay, so we're talking about CLIA, right? The Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, those laws, right? The Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, CLIA, ensures that quality and accuracy of laboratory testing, right? CLIA applies to every human clinical laboratory in the United States, right? Under CLIA, all laboratories and clinics that do testing must be inspected. The only labs that do not need to be inspected are labs that only do waived tests. Okay, so if you work in a little clinic where all they do in that clinic is waived tests, then you may not have to be inspected. Okay, but the big laboratories will be inspected by CLIA. So 3 categories of tests fall under CLIA, right? We've been over this before, right? Waived, moderately complex, and highly complex. Okay, we talked about these over and over again in other PowerPoint presentations. other lectures. Tests are categorized depending on the difficulty of conducting the test, right? How hard is it to do this test? That's why those wave tests are very easy. As a matter of fact, they sell glucose monitors in CVS and Walgreens. They sell drug tests that you can do at home there, pregnancy tests, right? These are the kind of tests that are waived, that doctors' offices have at their disposal so they can immediately find out if someone's pregnant, immediately find out if they have strep or the flu, immediately find out, if their hemoglobin or hematocrit's low, if their glucose is high or low. It helps us, that point of care testing helps us better take care of that patient quickly right then, okay? But these moderately complex and highly complex, they show the more difficulty it is of running and interpreting these tests. Also, the risk of harm to the patient if the test is not performed correctly, okay? They take CLIA takes all these things in consideration when they talk about the wave moderately complex and highly complex. So, in summary of this chapter, we talked about basic legal terms, consent, how to avoid litigation, HIPAA, the liability insurance, and common issues in lawsuits against healthcare workers and preventative tips. Okay, so now, so that was the most of chapter 3, guys. So make sure that you read that chapter in your textbook, get out your study guides that are in your black lecture binder, and make sure you're filling that out and studying them, okay? So here's chapter 1, part 2, okay? So after studying the second half of this chapter, the learner should be able to discuss quality improvement and tools that help with quality improvement. And guys, anytime you can pause these things and come back and watch them later. You do not have to, I know these are long. This is why there's a lot of information out there. I want to make sure y'all get it. This is why a lot of times we don't get to test you on chapter 6. This is a lot of information we have to get out there to you. And we do this because we want to make sure that you get every bit of the information that you need to be the best phlebotomist you can be, okay? So pause this at any time, go do something else, whatever, study chapter 3, then come back and watch this one, okay? So we're going to discuss quality improvement and tools that help with quality improvement, okay? So let's go here. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you've taken intro to psychology, you know what this is. If you don't, this is really neat right here, guys. Make sure go and you look at this. You can get a lot more information on this online and other places. This is really something that will help you not only in your job as a healthcare worker moving forward in your career, but also just in your everyday life. It's very interesting. So what does this mean here that we see, right? Maslow hierarchy of needs. What's that about? Okay, you see that pyramid over there to your right. What this is talking about is that to progress to the top of the pyramid, right? We all want to be at the top, right? That means you've reached, everything's great, right? To progress up there, one need after the other, the more basic needs must be satisfied first. So in other words, the most basic needs down at the bottom, right? Your need for air, food, water, just those basic needs that everybody needs. You know, if you don't drink water, you're going to die pretty quick. If you don't can breathe, you're going to die pretty quick. You live a little longer, but you do need food, right? Then the next thing is we need to feel safe and secure, okay? We need to feel love and that we belong, right? We need to have self-esteem. And then in the end, we have self-actualization, right? These are how we meet to the top of that pyramid. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is very good because it makes us realize that if we don't give people those basic needs of air, food, and water, if we don't make them feel safe and secure and loved, and they don't feel good about themselves and they can't do, then it's harder for them to reach that stage of really knowing who they are and what they can do, okay? So, quality, okay? What is quality, okay? When we talk about excellence, high standards, and superiority, the quality of something, right? Quality in healthcare can be considered in two categories, right? Scientific and interpersonal. Okay, Let's look at scientific first. It deals with how well clinical skills are applied to the situation. For example, how well the healthcare worker picks the correct equipment and technique for drawing a patient's blood. Okay? Because if you pick the right equipment, you use the appropriate needle, then you can get all your blood the first time, right? If you do your skin puncture properly, and you know how I've talked about this, nobody wants to hurt anybody, but if you don't hold that lancet down hard against the finger, and as you're holding pressure down on that finger, push down on the trigger, and then once it pops them, okay, I understand it hurts. They may go, ouch, right? But you hold it there, 1, 2, and then that lancet goes where? Directly in that sharps container, right? But getting that really good initial stick, okay, prevents you from having to go back, right, and stick them again, which we never want, right? If you make sure that you use the appropriate needle, you use the appropriate technique, remember? Okay, we hold our skin back, we anchor our veins so that it doesn't roll, so that it doesn't hurt, right? We make sure the alcohol dries for several reasons. First, to do its job, but secondly, it cuts down on its stinging of the patient, right? That's scientific, okay? That deals with those clinical skills and how they're applied to each situation. Then we have interpersonal, right? That deals with whether services are convenient and timely, or if the patient is satisfied with the comfort or safety of the environment they were in, okay? So this is talking about quality assurance, right? And remember how I talked about there is quality assurance means that from the time their foot stepped out of their car in the parking lot of the clinic or the hospital or wherever to the time they are discharged and leave your facility, how was their quality of care throughout, okay? And that's what we're looking at with that. So quality of phlebotomy services focuses not only on meeting a minimum standard, but also on constantly improving services that are provided. Okay? And you guys, you know this. You're going to be one of those people that does the bare minimum at their job, or you're going to be that person that is always constantly trying to improve and make their experience better for themselves, for their fellow co-workers, and for their patients and the patients' families, right? And then we have things that you need to know. Stakeholders. Stakeholders is an important word because not only when we're talking about this setting, but as a lot of you know, I do a lot of public health, and stakeholders are important when you're talking about community and public health. Okay, what are we talking about when we talk about stakeholders dealing with healthcare and dealing with phlebotomists, right? Customers, okay, they're stakeholders. Anybody that has a stake in it, right? So customers or individuals or groups that have an interest in the quality of healthcare services. So as you can see from that definition, any individuals or groups, customers or anybody that has an interest in the quality of the healthcare services, right? Those are all stakeholders. So then you have those external stakeholders, right? That's your local community and outside healthcare organizations. So think about this, guy. If you live in a rural area, and let's just say Minden, okay? And not all of Minden is rural, okay? But let's just say you live in Minden, okay? You work in Minden, your home's in Minden, your family's in Minden. You really wouldn't want to see the hospital closed there in Minden. And you want to make sure that that hospital has the best quality services possible. Why? Because that means you feel confident to be able to go to that hospital and use that hospital services if you feel confident that they're providing quality health care. And you're a stakeholder because you don't want to have to drive 30, 40, 45 minutes away in traffic on the interstate. You want to be able to depend on the quality of health care provided at Minden Medical for you as a person who lives in Minden, okay? Also, if you are a pharmacy there in Minden, if you are a durable medical equipment provider, a home health provider, okay? You are not inside that hospital, but you work with that hospital. You send your patients to that hospital. You get patients sent to you. And you want to make sure that the quality of care they're getting, their policies and their procedures are done properly because that affects you, okay? As a home health provider, as a durable medical equipment provider, right? And then there's internal stakeholders, such as patients, right? Whether they're inpatients or outpatients within that healthcare organization. Also, right, internal stakeholders could be you as an employee there at Minden Medical. And you, of course, care that you're getting not the minimum standard, but the highest quality care you can receive, right? So analyze this situation for me, okay? You can pause this, read through it, and see if you're answering these questions properly to see if you're able to use the things you're learning in both lecture and lab to be able to use them effectively as a phlebotomist out there in the field when you're working. So, guys, we always want to improve, or we should want to improve. That's why they have continuing education, because we know in healthcare, and not just in phlebotomy, if you're in nursing, respiratory therapy, radiology, whatever it may be, there's new safety devices comes out, there's new technique, new reagent, new machinery, and sadly, new diseases, like this new novel COVID-19 that we're dealing with, right? And we have to be constantly improving, constantly learning, constantly making sure we stay on top of things, because if we're not doing that, if we're not putting the funding into healthcare that we need, if we're not all working together as a healthcare team to improve, then we're not going to see stuff like COVID-19 coming, and we might not be ready for it. And we always want to be ready. We always want to know what's the latest technology out there that we can use to provide the highest quality care to our patient. What's the latest safety devices out there so that we as healthcare workers can stay safe and that we can keep our patients and our family members safe, right? That's why you always want to be informed and educated, okay? The perceptions of quality, right? Because there's quality and then there's how people perceive the quality that you have, right? It is very important that you as phlebotomists assume some responsibility in that continuous quality improvement, okay? Guys, I hope you take this stuff serious when you get out there working. You are a vital member of the healthcare team, and it takes us all working together to make this stuff work, okay? So some healthcare organizations have adopted specific quality improvement models, such as this Sigma 6, okay? It's a method designed to improve process performance by reducing variation, improve quality, enhancing financial performance, and improving customer satisfaction. I just want to touch on this. Right now we're talking about COVID-19. I know you guys are watching a lot of the news out there. This is why we need reduced variation, okay? Reduced variation, what do you think that means? Okay, so think about this. We need to make sure we're all working together. We're the United States of America, right? That's why each state has our governor, right? And then you have local leaders, whether it's your mayors, your CADO commissioners, your city council members. These are all local leaders that work together to set laws, to make decisions, to do things to make sure that the city, at the city level, is functioning. Then we have at the county level, right? And then we have at the state level. And then we have at the federal level. And the reason we need the federal government to step in sometimes and make sure that as a United States, we're all working together for the health care of all people in all states is because sometimes you have things that aren't just affecting the city of Shreveport or the Caddo Parish. You're having things not just affecting that state or the tri-state area. You're having things that affect the entire United States and, as in COVID-19, the entire globe. So we have to have policies and procedures in place so that we can all work together as a team so that we're all doing it the same way. Because if we're all giving the same kind of treatment, then that means everybody knows what their job is and what they're supposed to do and how it's done so that we can make sure that we're not varying from things. That what we're doing in Louisiana is the same thing we're doing in Mississippi because we're border each other, right? And we want to make sure we're all doing it the same way so that we have real quality, right? So that's why these things are very important. And you can see real world folding out in front of our eyes with COVID-19, why these things are so important, okay? So quality improvement for phlebotomists, these are some things that you can look at. Your technique, right? You always want to be improving and practicing your technique. That's why I hope right now you're at home and you have your white lab binder out at some point and you're going back through those steps from the first step of washing your hands and donning the appropriate PPE all the way down to your post-analytical phases of reporting out results and of making sure you dispose of your trash properly, okay? Practice makes perfect, right? Tying your techniques, tying your tourniquet, learning to tie your tourniquet with your gloves on, proper patient ID. Make sure you're practicing at home. Hi, my name is Melissa. I'm from the lab. I'm here to draw your blood, right? Okay? Can you please tell me your full name and your date of birth, right? Or you're on any type of medication, or you're on any type of special diet. Did your doctor ask you to fast? You know, did he ask you not to eat anything since last night? Have you done any real strenuous exercising in the last 48 hours, right? These are all things that we can do to provide in quality improvement. In practicing these things and putting them into play as ways that we can work it. Waiting times, right? Guys, I'm sorry, but it's a fact. I know you're working hard there. You're running around sometimes, working really hard, okay? But that's what you should do. You're being paid a wage to work while you're there. And that's just a fact. You get your breaks, you go to your lunch, but while you're working, you should be working. And one of the things in your mind should be quality insurance, quality improvement. What are the things that I can do to make sure that patient doesn't sit in that waiting room all day waiting to come back here? What are the turnaround time things that I can do to improve? How can I think these things through? It's like I told you, when you're allowing your alcohol to dry and do its job, that's when you can get your stuff together. These are things that I teach. These are things that you can learn to make. You're killing two birds with one stone, right? You're making sure that you're using your time wisely so you can decrease the time your patient has to sit out there in that waiting room. You want to work on complications such as hematomas and hitting nerves. You want to make sure that your recollection and repeat rates are low and that you constantly work on making sure that you stick them the first time and get everything you need. Okay? You want to make sure that you're working with the other healthcare team members to make sure that you don't want multiple sticks on that same patient. Now, yes, people are going to have to get stuck more than once while they're in a hospital, but we want to make sure those duplicate test orders, which cause those multiple sticks on the same patient when they don't need to, are not being done. And these things are all things that you as a phlebotomist can work to improve the quality of care that your patients are receiving. Still dealing with your perceptions, right? Perceptions of quality, right? Poor patient outcomes should be avoided, okay? These are the 5 D's of poor patient outcomes, okay? Of course, at the top, and the worst patient outcome we could have is death, right? Disease, and when we say that, you don't want them to come into the hospital because they fall and broke their hip and end up getting pneumonia or some other nosocomial infection or disease while they're in the hospital. That's when we want to do all we can to prevent infections from being transferred from one patient to the other. Disability, right? We want to make sure we put that bed rail back up. We want to make sure we use proper technique when we're sticking our patient. We don't want them to have something happen to them, whether it's a fall or an improper needle stick, that leads to some type of disability, okay? Discomfort. They're in the hospital. I know that being stuck, having IV started is not comfortable, right? But we want to do all the things we can to avoid discomfort, to make sure they're as comfortable as they can be, as safe as they can be, right? And then in the end, the very last one is dissatisfaction, right? If we're communicating properly with our patients, we're making sure that they understand the communication we're giving them. If we take care of them in a timely fashion, right? If we're respectful and empathetic to them, right? If we treat them with respect, they will not have a dissatisfaction. Okay, that's just a fact. If we are doing all these things that we've talked about over chapter 2, over chapter 3, and now over part 2 of chapter 1, if we're putting all these things together and all the other things that we've learned, they will not be dissatisfied. they're going to be dissatisfied, okay? If you're not using proper technique, if you're not treating them with respect, if you're not treating them with empathy, if you're not worried about doing your job in a timely fashion and they have to sit and wait long periods of time, yes, then they're going to be dissatisfied. And they have a right to be. And so would you if you were in their shoes. Okay, then there's tools. We always talk about tools in our toolbox, things that we can use to make our job better, right? So what are the tools for quality performance assessment, right? We're trying to assess our quality performance, right? Because how will we know if we don't do an assessment of our quality performance, okay? Then how will we know where we are? Then we won't know where we need to make improvements, right? So tools for implementing this continuous, because this is always ongoing, quality improvement. We have flow charts, right? We have flow charts breaking down the process into its different components, right? Flow, study tip, right? Flow from one process to the next. Pareto charts are bar charts that show the frequency of the problem, okay? So we want to show the number of hematomas we had in January, February, March, and April. And as you see, it's going up. We're having more and more hematomas. Okay, so if we're seeing that, then we need to investigate that, see where that problem's coming from, so we can see if there needs to be some re-education, some retraining. We need to show that we are seeing the problem and we have things in place to take care of it. Okay, because this principle says that 80% of the trouble comes from 20% of the problem. Okay, which is meaning we don't have a lot of problems. Usually it's one or two people that are either not doing it right, they need to be retrained or re-educated on something, and those few amount of problems are causing all this trouble, okay? So if we track these issues, then we can find out what the problem is, and we can correct it and get those numbers back down, right? These are all ways, how will we know what's going on if we're not documenting it and tracking it, right? So then there is a cause and effect on Ishwana diagrams, right, which you see over here to your right, right? You want to identify interactions between the equipment that we're using, the methods that we're using, the people, and the supplies, okay? Remember, interaction, the interaction between all these things, right? Because remember how I talked about they've come out with a new safety thing, like the new butterfly with the push button, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to let the frontline workers who use this decide if they want to use it. We're going to put it out with them. They're going to test it. And then we're going to see what the interaction is between this safety device that should be really good. What's the method of how to use it? Make sure you're using it properly. The people that's using it and their supplies to make sure this is really something that we need to do. Then there's a plan, do, check, act cycle, right? Plan. You come up with a plan, right? And this is, think of it as a cycle that we're constantly going through that leads us back to making decisions so we can get better and better and better at this, right? Positive changes in the right direction. So you got a problem, right? So you come up with a plan to either solve that problem or you come up with a plan to do something, right? We have an issue that we need to get something done, so we have a plan to get it done, right? So then we carry out that plan, but as we're carrying out that plan, from implementation all the way down, we need to check the plan to see if there is improvement. And then we need to act on those results. And in other words, if we get results that something is not right, then we need to go back and change that, right? I hate it when people call folks flip-floppers. You know, you felt one way about something 1 minute, and then you changed your mind and felt differently. Well, you know, the saying is we do better when we know better. Sometimes we think that things are a certain way, okay, because of our beliefs or things that we're taught. But then when we get in there and we actually start doing it, we see that that's not really true. And so we should be smart enough to make those changes to show improvement. We don't just say, well, we've always done it that way. If it's not effective, if it's not efficient, if it's not doing it right, we need to change it. I don't care how long we've been doing it. So we have line graphs, histograms, scatter diagrams, all kinds of things that can show us, you know, what's going on so we can identify that there is a problem. And then if we implement something to change, to hopefully do better, then we can use these graphs to see if it is doing better. So right here, you see over here to your right, you see patient wait times, right? So we're recording those wait times. Now, so if we see over time that these wait times are going up and up and up, we want to see where the bottleneck is. What's causing the problem of these people waiting longer? So then we sit down and we brainstorm. We brainstorm about, okay, so we had to implement this procedure, right? Maybe it's a safety procedure, that really needs to stay there. But that procedure is causing patients' wait times to go up. So we need to brainstorm to come up with a method or a solution to keep that safety procedure in place, but to be able to bring those patient wait times down. Maybe we need to hire more staff, okay? Maybe we need to open up a second lab. We need to be able to brainstorm, and then if we come up with something from hiring more employees to opening up a second lab, we need to be able to put those things in place, but guess what? We need to track them. Because if we see that data going up, the wait times going up and up and up, and we identify that it was a safety procedure that we had to put in place, that we need to keep there, but it is slowing things down, we brainstorm, figure out what it is, and we steady collect those wait times, put that data in there, right? And we slowly see those wait times starting to go back down, then we realize that what we implemented is working, right? And we can prove that unequivocally. We can show with the data that what we implemented is working. But if we don't see those going down, then we go back to the drawing board, right? We realize we tried that, it didn't work, let's brainstorm again, let's come up with something, and let's track it. But we never stop trying to improve. We can always get better, okay? So talking about laboratory testing cycles, okay? And y'all have heard me say post-analytical phase, right? So we talked about these before. We have examples of our pre-analytical phase, our analytical phase, and our post-analytical factors. And these affect the quality of our laboratory results, all these phases of it, right? Let's go through these because you guys are going to need to know these. What is the pre-analytical phase? And for medical terminology, we know pre is before, right? So these are the things that happen before the blood is drawn, right? Patient identification, right? Getting that information on their age, gender, blood type, diet, etc., right? Exercise routines, what medication they're on. The technique, such as your tourniquet application, site selection, choosing the appropriate equipment, okay? And then what happens? You draw the blood, but this is still pre-analytical. And the reason we refer to it is because analytical phase is the testing phase, right? So there's stuff that we want to do before we draw the blood to make sure that we're getting the correct blood and that we're using the proper technique. And then once we've collected that equipment, does it need to be shielded from light? Does it need to get to the laboratory in a much even faster manner? Does it need to be put in an ice water slurry? Should it be transported warm? All these things have to do with the quality of those laboratory test results that we put out, right? Then the way it's processed, okay? Was it allowed to clot? Was it spun down properly? When you transferred it from that tube to the transfer tube, did you make sure that the name, that the identification was the same? Was it stored properly? If it couldn't be done right now, was it put in the refrigerator? All these are before testing. There's things you do before you draw the patient's blood, things you do immediately after you draw the patient's blood, transporting it, processing. All those things are pre-analytical, and they all affect the quality of those laboratory test results that we put out, that we are diagnosing, monitoring, treating our patients, right? Then we have that analytical phase. That's testing reliability and accuracy, which also makes sure we want to be running our QC, making sure our QC is on track, right? Making sure that all the maintenance and quality control checks have been done on all our instrumentation, including things like centrifuges, right? Then there's our post-analytical phase. Reporting those results, making sure critical values are getting to the right person in a timely fashion, making sure that we follow up or repeat any test that we need to, okay? All three of these phases are important. What we do before we draw the blood, what we do after we've collected the blood, before we get to the analytical phase where the testing is done to make sure that maintenance, quality control, and calibrations have done on all instruments and machines being used to make sure we run those tests. And then It's going to do us little good if we're not making sure that those results get reported out, that we flag any critical values. If something is out of range, we're following up with it. We're repeating those tests, right? These are all important to make sure that the quality of our laboratory test results are spot on. Okay? And we talked about quality control on and on, right? It's a key component of laboratory quality assurance, right? So any equipment, we made to make sure that quality control checks are run. Everything from thermometers to blood pressure cuffs to vacutainer tubes to needles, right? We want to make sure of that. They're not expired. And you know, I told you when you go to take the cap off your needle, right? It's the last thing you do. You want to look down at it, make sure your bevel's up, right? But you also want to notice, are there any burrs on the tip of that needle? Is it bent? Is there anything wrong with it? This is why phlebotomists get in a hurry, and these little things, they start taking them for granted. Making sure that you look down at that needle, not only to make sure your bevel is up, but look at your needle. Do you see a burr on it? Is it bent? You wouldn't want to stick that into a patient's arm. And that's you paying attention to what you're doing, okay? So when we use those centrifuges, we talked about 3,500 to 4,500 RPMs, right? And that we need to maintenance those centrifuges and make sure that they are being, that they're doing it at the right speed, right? And that needs to be recorded and documented, right? Because if we're not documented that we're checking these centrifuges, how can we prove it to an accrediting body like Joint Commission or CAP? How can we prove it in a court of law if the hospital is sued over something? Okay, because we want to make sure that we get that blood separated out. And according to NACLS, the amount of time a specimen should be spun is 5 to 10 minutes. But most of the time you're looking at, it could be 5 to 10, it could be 10 to 15. Anywhere around that range is a good range for making sure you spin it down. And a lot is going to be what your facility's policy and procedure is. You may go work at a lab, excuse me, excuse me guys. You may go work in a lab and you know, the thing is it could be 5 to 10, 10 to 15. The lab you working at in your policy and procedure manuals, it could say all specimens are spun for 15 minutes. And that is making sure that there is no variability, okay? A lot of times like Willis-Knighton, all their labs are going to do everything the same way. So whether you're working at an outpatient lab in Bossier or whether you're working at an outpatient lab in Shreveport, if they've made a facility-wide decision that they want all their tubes spun down for 15 minutes, then that's what you will do, okay? So we look at about collecting whole blood, okay? So the correct amount of whole blood to draw for certain tests is about 2.5 times the amount of serum needed for the test, right? Because you're going to spin it down and only a portion of it's going to be that serum, right? So it needs to be about twice that, because most tubes, when you spin them down, you'll see it's almost about half and half of serum and cells. And so, you know, you need, as far as the whole blood in that tube, you need about 2.5 times more than the serum that you need to run that test. You can usually get about 2 to 3 tests from about 1 tube of whole blood, okay? Sometimes more. That the instruments are getting to the point where now they're using less and less blood, so you can get away with a little bit more. But again, you want to follow whatever the policies and procedures are for your specific lab and facility, okay? So looking at future trends in phlebotomy practice. So there's a growing attempt to standardize phlebotomy practices, such as providing international certification for phlebotomists. And now you'll see ASCP is now offering international certification. And again, COVID-19 is showing us. I know a lot of people want to say, you know, this is the United States, we're not worried about other places, but we all need to be worried about other places. You know, it's just too easy to get very quickly from one end of this globe to the other. And so to have uniform care, so we're all doing it the right way, so we'll all understand, so that we'll all see that you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. Because if you have a global pandemic where it starts in China and people are dying in Italy and Spain, if they're doing research there, we want to make sure if we want to learn from their research and they find that there's a drug that's really working really good, or they come up with a vaccine that's working really well, if what we're doing in America is not similar to what they're doing in Spain and Italy, it may not go back and forth. But if we're all doing it the same way, as far as healthcare is concerned, internationally, then we can really make sure that all this stuff matches up and we can get the healthcare to people that we need. We know that everything's shipped into the electronic medical records, right? And we know that this is becoming law, right? And that it presents problems related to security, standardization, and integration. We always are worried about security, right? We worry about one of the things is people getting in and hacking things, and we hear about this all the time. And we want to keep, again, this is another area where you want to keep being informed and educated. We never want to stop learning about technology. We can't say we're not going to do electronic voting or electronic medical records because somebody could hack it. What we have to do is we have to follow it, right? We have to use all the standard precautions we can, all the security precautions we can. And every time they get hacked, then we need to learn from that. We need to constantly improve so we can become better and better and better. So there's research efforts towards smaller and faster with little waste, right? We're worried about waste. We do not want to hurt our, sorry about the dogs, guys, hurt our environment any more than what we already are, okay? By waste materials. Many organizations now offering direct testing in a non-traditional setting. So you see that we've got, testing facilities set up in Walmart parking lots, in pharmacies, in places like that, which I think that's good because we can meet mass people where they are to be able to test them and vaccinate them in places. Also, you will now see, and you see this stuff on television, some of these very evasive procedures like colonoscopies. A lot of people don't get their colonoscopy done because they're scared of it. They're scared that something could go wrong. They're scared of the pain. They're scared of the humiliation. Well, now we're coming up with these tests that you can mail to these people. And in the privacy of their home, they can test themselves for colon cancer. Okay? We're having HIV testing that can be done at home. So you could check yourself in the privacy of your home to know your status, because we should all know our status, right? And a lot of CE credits are now available online almost instantaneously for you to be able to better yourself and be up to date and informed and educated on the latest trends in phlebotomy practice. So decentralization. So in the 1900s, many hospitals decentralized or moved phlebotomists from one central location to different hospital floors, right? There's some advantages to decentralization, pros and cons to most things, right? If you have a phlebotomist that's always in the emergency room, then they're right there, and when something comes in, they can take care of that, right? Now, a lot of people hate this because then what if there's nobody coming in and getting stuck? You're just sitting down there. There's other jobs they can find for that phlebotomist to do during that downtime. But I think having that phlebotomist dedicated to the ICU, having that phlebotomist with that additional training and stuff dedicated to the ER, these are things that I think just improve quality of care, okay? It eliminates unnecessary cost. It increases in communication from the nurse, the doctor, the family, and the patient because they can perform duties as a coordinated team rather than a specialist, okay? Because you can work together as that team. The phlebotomist working with the nurse, working with the admission clerks, working with the doctors, everybody working together as a team to make sure like I said, from the minute that person's foot hits the parking lot to the minute they leave, that we're all working together to take care of this patient in the most effective way possible. You want to become more sensitive to the patient's individual needs, and it also allows faster point of care testing and collection of blood, because we can have some very pointed like ABGs, glucoses, right? Things that we can do right there in that emergency room quickly to get the results that they need so that doctors will know what's going on so they can start that care. It just really works, okay? There's also disadvantages, like I said, pros and cons. So if other workers are not trained, it causes a problem. If they're not getting the training they need for this particular job, they may resent the extra work. It puts other healthcare workers at greater risk that are not properly trained. It extends lengths of time for patient to get better. Does not eliminate extra costs sometimes. Specimens not acceptable, not labeled, improperly labeled, patient not ID'd correctly, coag tubes not full, patient not drawn in a basal state, all these things that we train you to do. So when you talk about decentralization, the thing we have to remember is that you don't just say, hey, we're not going to have a phlebotomist down here in the ER. We're just going to let the nurses draw all the blood. That's when you run into those kinds of problems. Nurses have enough to learn. Okay, they have enough to do. They are not trained on all the needs necessary for phlebotomy. So if you're going to decentralize it, that's fine, but make sure you have a trained, certified phlebotomist in that position, right? Because if you're just putting that work off on somebody else that's not trained, they're going to be mad because you're giving them extra work, right? Because it's not a phlebotomist, okay? And then those healthcare workers, they may not have the training they need to properly use the equipment safety, and they could accidentally stick themselves, right? And then because they're not good at doing it, the patient may stay there longer, and then that ends up running up costs, and you're not really, saving money anyway. And then last, we talked about those specimens are not acceptable, right? Because they weren't trained on the right tube to draw it in, the order of draw, how to transport it, and all that. So in the second part of this chapter, we talked about quality improvement and tools that help with quality improvement, right? And like I said, guys, y'all can pause these videos at any time, stop them, go do something else, and come back, okay? This is a lot of information. I understand it's going to take you time to get through it. Like I said, we're not going to have a lab quiz number 6 or a lecture quiz number 6. But I want you to be able to watch these videos so that you will know. And you can pause them and fill out your study guides and then go back and study and read your chapters. So bioterrorism, this will be our last one, okay, and then we're done. Bioterrorism and emerging infectious disease. Wow, emerging infectious diseases. This will be the first time I've taught this that I think about COVID-19, okay? So our learning objective after studying this information will be that you can discuss bioterrorism and you can talk about emerging infectious diseases that we should have on our radar and be concerned about. Okay, bacterial bioterrorism agents, okay? So after 9/11, bioterrorism became a threat, and all labs should perform risk assessment. Now, we should be performing risk assessment, and I hope we are, and that we learn all the things that we did wrong and all the things that we did right dealing with COVID-19. A lot of our governors, a lot of our mayors did some really good work. They made some really tough and hard decisions to cause us all to have to be quarantined. But these are things that we needed to do to lessen the spread of the disease, right? Now, once COVID-19 is over, we need to go back and we need to look from the beginning to the end, and we need to see what we did right, what we did wrong, and how we can improve, because this will not be the last novel virus or bacterial agent that comes to us, and we need to improve on what we've done. Our states need to improve, our federal government needs to improve, and we need to see where we went wrong so that we can make sure that if this happens again, we handle it better than we did this time. And I'm not saying that nobody handled it good and it was horrible and everything was wrong, okay? In anything like this, there were things that were done correctly and things that were done wrong. But the only way you can improve is to admit on the things you did wrong and admit on the things that you did wrong and right? Look at what was right, look at what was wrong, and then make improvements from there. If you're not willing to admit that things didn't go right and that you yourself, whether you're the politician or administrator of hospitals or a supervisor or whomever, okay? If you're one of those people that didn't stay at home, that you went willy-nilly and wherever you wanted to go, okay? You need to admit the things that you did right and admit the things that you did wrong so that you can improve on them, okay? So talking about bacterial bioterrorism, okay? So laboratories must identify procedures and methods that have a potential to produce aerosols, which are fine particles that suspended in air, right? And we want to use biosafety cabinets or hoods to perform tasks in a way to avoid exposure to aerosols, right? That's why we get behind those plexiglass shields, right? That's when I talked about making slides. You can make slides from a purple top, but we don't want to take that purple top off, right? Because we could perform, when snapping the top off that purple top tube could cause fine particles to be produced in an aerosol form into the air, and then you could breathe it in. That's why you want to be behind that safety glass, right? If you take that top off. That's why they make safety devices like the little white thing that we stick into our purple top so we can turn it on, turn it over, put it onto a slide and push down and one drop of blood comes out, right? These are things that we put into place to cut down on our exposure risk, right? The CDC recommends referring any suspicious organisms or substance to the proper authorities and practicing the proper biosafety techniques at all times. Because that's the minute we see an outbreak in our hospital. We see an outbreak in our nursing home. We see an outbreak with our home health patients. In our facilities, we need to report this stuff immediately and start tracing and tracking these patients and making sure we're seeing if this is turning into an epidemic, if this is turning into a pandemic, if this could be bioterrorism, so that the right authorities can look into these things. We have to track and report this stuff. So most of the bacteria, viruses, and toxins used in bioterrorism agents can be spread by an aerosol route, which is very stable, right? You know, you've heard about biowarfare, right? And there are some people out there with these conspiracy theories right now that's saying that COVID-19 was bioterrorism. Now, telling you right now, I don't buy that. I'm not saying that I believe that, but I'm just telling you to help you understand bioterrorism. Someone could take a virus and they could go into a mall or a ball game somewhere where there's large amounts of people, and they could release it into the air, right? Then we could breathe that in and we could get sick, right? And it would be a bioterrorism agent used to kill people. It's a way that they could do that, okay? Okay, I know you guys have heard of anthrax. We had some issues with that in the past. It's caused by a Bacillus anthracis. It's a gram-positive bacillus, which is a rod, right, that forms endospores, right? It is a disease of livestock who fed on plants contaminated with the organism, okay? Human beings that contact anthrax, most of the time by contact with animals or animal products. For this reason, it's also called a wool sorter's disease, because those people that were shearing the lambs and getting that wool from them, from the sheep, and then they were sorting it out. If you've ever been in a barn, or if you've seen a picture of a barn where there's hay or grass, you can look in the sunshine and see all these particles floating around in the air, right? Well, this was endospores, spores, right? And they were on the wool of these animals. And as they were sorting them out, of course, these spores were flying up into the air, and then those workers were breathing it in and coming down with anthrax. It is not spread from person to person, but by contact with those spores, right? So if bioterrorists could take those anthrax spores, put them in an envelope, mail it to somebody, somebody opens up the envelope, those spores come out into the atmosphere, into your air, you breathe them in, and then you can come down with anthrax. It's not the same as like coughing or sneezing, and then the cough and sneeze gets on you, you breathe it in or get it in your mucous membranes, your eyes or your nose, and you get sick. This is from that spore, but that's why they call it the wool sorter's disease, because they shear that wool off of that sheep, and then they have to sort it. Well, as they're moving it around, it's like when you take your rug outside, right? and you were to shake your rug and you look up into the air, you would see all these particles floating, right? It's the same situation there. So before September of 2001, the last case of inhalation of anthrax in the United States occurred in 1978. That was the last time prior to September of 2001. We had not seen this since 1978. But then in September and October of 2001, anthrax was spread through letters in the mail. A number of people developed the cutaneous form, right, on your skin, and at least 10 contracted the inhalation form, okay? So you can either inhale it and it gets in your lungs, which is serious, or you can get it on your skin. And if you'll go back to the slide before, you'll see that person down there in the bottom, that picture of the bottom slide. You see those sores, looks like spots on them. That's from the cutaneous development form of anthrax. So 6 of those 10 survived, probably because they were treated early with a combination of antibiotics, because we've seen anthrax before, right? So we do have a treatment, and that's the concern with COVID-19 and why we've been in the position that we're in. When something comes along and it's novel, which means new, right? We've never seen it before. We don't have our immunity. We don't have any herd immunity to it. We haven't seen it before. We don't know how it spread. We don't know how long it lasts. We don't know. We have no vaccine to it. We don't know what treatments work. That's why we're so scared of COVID-19, because we didn't know anything. Okay, but with anthrax by 2001, we had some tools that we could go to, some combinations of certain antibiotics, some things that we could do that if we found it early and treated it early, we could get that survival rate up much higher than it was when anthrax was new and first came onto the scene and was infecting people, and we didn't know what it was, and we didn't know how it was spread, and we didn't know what worked and didn't work. We have to go through these things. That's why it was so important that people quarantine during this time. So the forms in human beings, like I talked about, is that cutaneous, and y'all can go back and look at that picture, it's those blisters and stuff. Like you inhale it, pulmonary, and you can eat it from that meat if it's uncooked meat. That's why we always talk about cooking your meat properly. That's why I eat less and less and less and less meat, because it can get into your gastrointestinal tract. So other emerging infectious diseases, right? So we always need to be on the lookout for new diseases, right? God, y'all have no idea. I teach this semester after semester, and it really hits home today as well. I'm teaching from my home because of COVID-19. We always need to be aware of new diseases that could come out, okay? New infectious disease occur and may occur suddenly, whereas others seem to disappear and then reemerge, right? Some of the most important reasons for these trends are the growth of our human population, okay? The rise in international travel and environmental changes. Don't be fooled. Climate change is real. And climate change affects droughts, it affects animals, it's going to affect everything. And these environmental changes will cause new and emerging infectious diseases. And we need to be aware of that. We need to take it serious. We need to fund public health, and we need to fund healthcare. So some emerging and severe diseases we must be aware of, right? And I'll have to add a new one to this now, right? SARS virus. SARS was one of, just like MERS was one of the respiratory infections that comes from one of the strains of the coronavirus, right? Okay, then we have Ebola, right? There's been several outbreaks in Africa. We had that hantavirus that mainly affected the Southwest, and it came from deer droppings. And a lot of these respiratory infections are really, really serious, guys. Okay, and then the hantavirus, somewhere in the Southwest, there would be these rats, and then say that you would go into your storage building outside, right? And you're going to clean it up. It's springtime. You're going to get out there and you're going to do some spring cleaning. And you get out there and you're sweeping, okay? Well, if you look up, you'll see as you're sweeping if you've ever been outside, sweeping under your carport, sweeping somewhere, you'll see, if you look in the sunlight, little dust particles coming up everywhere. Well, the problem with the hantavirus is there was there was rat droppings that people weren't aware of, and when they would go to sweep them up, it would loosen particles that would fly up in the air and they would breathe them in. So make sure if you're doing something like that, if you're going out into a barn or a shed and you're working out there cleaning things up, get you one of those masks, okay? Get you one of those masks to wear so you make sure you're not breathing that stuff in. Then we're talking about hepatitis C, this hepatitis C virus, that came around. We see all kinds of Escherichia coli, E. coli infections, new strains. We had the 157H7, which caused hemolytic uremic syndrome, right? Severe anemia and kidney failure, right? And then we have, of course, HIV, which caused AIDS. And now we have COVID-19. And guys, nobody's trying to scare anybody. If we are prepared, if we do the things we need to do to prepare on a federal level, on a state level, and on a local level, and you say to yourself, well, what can I do? I'm just this lowly person going to school for phlebotomy, trying to get out and find a job. You can vote. You can stay informed, and you can stay educated. And you can make sure you register to vote and go and vote. That's how you can make a difference. Because we want to make sure that our local leaders, our state leaders, and our federal leaders are putting the money out there to protect healthcare workers, to protect bus drivers, to protect people who work in grocery stores and gas stations. We want to make sure that we're funding hospitals. We want to make sure where states have the funding that they need to make sure that they can have the PPE that they need, to make sure that they can have the capacity for testing, to make sure that they can have the employees that they need. We need epidemiologists, we need public health workers, we need community health workers that are getting out there and getting ahead of the game, right? And you can make sure that you hold your elected officials responsible for funding these things. We fund our military. Why do we do that? Why do we have a military? Okay? We have a military to protect our borders so that no one can invade us, right? And try to take us over, right? So we want to make sure we have the latest and greatest military power, the latest and greatest airplanes, right? Guns, ammunition, stealth technology, right? Intel, intelligence to know when someone might be going to attack the U.S. We need money for that. We fund our military. We also need to fund the CDC. When we need to fund public health, we need to fund health care so that they too can have the resources they need to fight any new and emerging infectious diseases that may come our way. Here's some information on Ebola, okay? It's a viral disease and it causes hemorrhagic fever, okay? And it's a very lethal. Now, the one good thing about Ebola is it kills so quickly, so fast, that it doesn't have time to spread. And even though it seems so horrible, right now, if to be honest, it's not nearly as bad as something like COVID-19. Because see, with Ebola, you get sick quickly, and it kills you really, really fast. Now, that's terrible, and that sounds terrible. But the only good thing about it is it doesn't give you a chance to spread that from person to person. Okay? The problem with COVID-19 is like with the flu sometimes and like with strep throat and a cold and things like that, you get infected, right? You're around somebody that has something like COVID-19, right? And they cough and cough and cough and you're sitting in a waiting room across from them, you breathe it in and now you have it. But you don't know you have it, right? You might wake up one morning, you feel a little sick, but you don't feel that sick, right? And so you go to the grocery store and start coughing a little bit, so you cough, right? And you're trying to cover up as best you can, but some of it's getting out, right? Because even if you cough into your elbow, some of that spray, right, is getting out of there. You can't protect it all. If you don't have a big rag to put over your whole face, it's going to get out there, right? So you go through the grocery store, you cough a few times in there, you leave the grocery store, you have to go to the gas station, get some gas, you have to go in, get something, right? You go to work, you're around your significant other, they go to work, they go to the grocery store. Do you see? And nobody knows. Nobody knows they're infectious, so they're out there spreading it to other people who then don't know. So when something takes a while to manifest and to make you realize you're sick, and You can be sick for weeks and not know it, or you can be sick and you think, well, I got a bad cold, but what you don't realize is you don't have a bad cold. You have something worse than that, right? So that's the issue with COVID versus Ebola, okay? So the disease is characterized by a really high fever, and you start bleeding out of every orifice of your body, and literally, sadly, your internal organs start to bleed, and literally you bleed to death. It is a very brutal, horrible disease, okay? Transmission comes from direct contact of the infectious body fluids, such as blood, urine, semen, saliva, while that person is sick. And like I said, usually that incubation period is short. They get sick pretty fast right after they get infected. And unfortunately, they know they're sick with it. It's pretty brutal. And sadly, they die pretty quickly. The only upside to that at all is that they're just not able to spread it to so many people. So zoonotic, right? Y'all been hearing about this, about the open air markets in China and Wuhan and where it came from, right? I put up some videos on COVID-19. So zoonotic, so bats are the most likely reservoir for Ebola virus. And they pass the infection from like a bat to like a gorilla. And then maybe the gorilla spreads it to the deer, and then maybe the deer to the human, right? So sooner or later it jumps, right? Jumps from an animal to a human, and then from there, from human to human contact. And that's why you worry about these new novel viruses like corona, because you're not sure. So it jumped from the animal to the human. Can we now spread it from human to human? Is it spread airborne? Is it spread through blood? We don't know. So in the beginning, you just don't know. And that's what makes these new viruses so scary. Because until we realize what's going on, it's hard for us to get ahead of it, right? It's hard for us to treat it. It's hard for us to stop the spread, right? So Ebola usually presents with that acute onset. That's what I'll talk about. Typically 8 to 10 days after exposure. Sometimes it can go 2 to 21, but usually it's pretty quick, okay? So signs and symptoms are lined out here, right? So you always want to know what those are. And we need to, this is taking a disease and giving it its content, right? And this is important. We need to know, when do you get your onset of your symptoms, okay? How long could you be running around and exposing other people when you don't even know you're sick? These are things we need to know about diseases. And until we know this until we knew it about the COVID-19, it was hard to know what we needed to do. So here's some very unpleasant pictures having to do with Ebola. So you see that bleeding in the gums, bleeding out at your IV sites, the hematemesis, which means that vomiting up of blood. These are all things that happen with Ebola. So the Ebola virus, continuing on it, you want to talk about, so once you know, what's the symptoms, so you'll know to look for it, how long can you have it before you show symptoms, when can you still be infectious, all these things are things we need to know about any of these emerging diseases, viruses, bacteria, things like that, right? And so we also need to know what's the appropriate PPE required. So the CDC says protection for Ebola, you need a surgical gown, you need a surgical hood that completely covers the head and the neck. You need a full face shield, not goggles, okay? And you need an N95 respirator. So if you have an Ebola patient in your hospital, these are the things that will be on the cart outside that patient's room that you must use before you go in to see that patient, because that's what the CDC recommends. Okay, they now recommend physicians rigorously train and demonstrate competency at both donning and doffing your PPE. Remember, that's why we went on and off. I showed those videos. We go on and on. I know y'all wonder why, about properly wearing in your PPE. And I see you guys all the time. I tell you, button up your lab jacket in the front, right? If you're pregnant at the time and you're out there working, put 2 surgical gowns on if that's what you need to do to make sure that you are fully covered, okay? And they need to go over this with people annually, honestly. And they need to show competency. You need to be trained yearly on what you should be doing, from hand washing to donning and doffing of your PPE. You need to show it back to me, right? Again, going right back to that communication. You need to show me that I showed you how to do it. Now I need you to show me back that you understood what I showed you and you can do it properly, right? So here's how, this is data, right? This is data that we collect, the date that they reported it, total cases, confirmed cases, right? So we had all these cases, and that's another thing you're hearing out there, what did they really die of COVID-19? Let me explain something, guys. Okay, so if you're 59 years old, you are morbidly obese, and you have COPD, you smoke, you have high blood pressure, diabetes, right? Are you probably, due to all those things, going to die sooner than you should? Yes, probably you will, because you have all these risk factors for heart disease, cancer, and all this, right? And most likely you're shortening your life by smoking. You're shortening your life by not getting on a more healthy diet and by getting moving and losing weight and getting your diabetes and high blood pressure under control. But you would probably live another 10, maybe 15 years. Maybe you'd live into your 70s. May not be the greatest quality of life, but you would still live it. But then COVID-19 comes along, and because your body is already struggling every day to keep you alive, that knocks you out and you die. There's some people out there saying, well, how do we know they just didn't die from their COPD? Because they didn't. Okay? Yes, they had COPD, but plenty of people live years and years and years into their 70s, even continuing to smoke with COPD. Now, I'm not telling you that's what you need to do, and I'm telling you their quality of life is terrible. They may be bedbound, they can't breathe, they're on oxygen, they're constantly in and out of the hospital. A lot of them end up not even being able to walk, and they spend their days sitting or laying in a bed all day long watching TV strapped to oxygen. That is not quality of life, but they're not dead. Okay, but the COVID-19 or some other, like the flu, comes along, and because they're immunosuppressed, because they're not healthy, they died from it. But they died from COVID-19. Okay, but if you died and you showed all the signs and symptoms of COVID-19, okay, you had the cough, you were put on a respirator, you weren't sick before then, and all of a sudden you can't breathe, you have the cough, you have all the signs and symptoms of COVID-19, and you die, but we don't have enough tests to test you to see if you were positive for COVID-19. That's where this comes from. You might be included in the total cases because you showed every sign and symptom of COVID-19 and you died, okay? But we couldn't confirm that because we didn't have the test to be able to test you to make sure you had it. But I look at it like this, guys. If I see a duck, okay, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's over there with the other ducks swimming in the water, I'm going to assume what? That it's a duck. So the reason they include these in total cases is because if during an outbreak of the seasonal flu, you come in showing every sign of the flu, then they're going to assume you have the flu, then they're going to test you for it, and then they're going to say, yes, you have the flu. Then you will not be included in any of these total cases, confirmed cases, or total deaths. Okay. Now, if you have something like COVID-19 that we did not have testing for, okay, everybody wasn't being tested. So you came in, you showed all the signs and symptoms of COVID-19, right? You were put on the ventilator, you unfortunately passed away. They're going to include you in the total cases. But until we can get a test to then go back and test that person, even when they're dead, to see if they test positive, we can't move you into the confirmed cases, right? Now, I don't know if you heard recently on the news that they have confirmed that there were people who died back in, I think it was, even before the people in Washington died, there were some people in California that died, and they have now tested them. They can test you even when you're dead. They have confirmed that those people had COVID-19. So now they can move them out of the total cases into the confirmed cases. So I hope that explains that, guys. So we're still talking about Ebola because At the time before COVID-19, Ebola was the big deal, right? It was that we had that patient in Dallas, that person in Dallas that got sick and all that. Ebola was a new emerging thing that we were worried about, and we're still worried about it. It should still be on our radar, right? This is serious. And what if somebody were to come in contact with somebody with Ebola and get on an airplane and fly here? Now, would it be as bad as something like COVID-19 where this many people would die? Unlikely. And the reason being is because they would probably get so sick they couldn't spread it as much. But it could still kill a lot of people, and it needs to be on our radar. So make sure you're pausing these videos, read about Ebola, make sure you know about this. You are working in healthcare now. You need to know about all the diseases and viruses and bacteria that are out there that could pose a risk for you, your patient's family, and frankly, your family. Be informed. Be educated. When we talk about human-to-human transmission, right? What are we talking about, right? Because like it jumped from an animal to us, and then they were worrying, can we transmit it from human to human? In the beginning, over in China, they weren't sure of that at first, right? Because it was a new, novel virus that we had not seen, this particular virus, so we weren't quite sure yet if it would transmit human to human. Sometimes it doesn't. Okay? Anthrax came from an animal. Remember we talked about this. To the human. And because they were sorting these wool that came off the sheep, the spores flew up into the air, and the human breathed it in and got anthrax, right? You could die from that. But it's not contagious from human to human. And we didn't know that at first about anthrax. We had to learn that. Okay? And we now know it's not a transmission that goes, I don't then cough anthrax out and you breathe it in and you get anthrax. That's not how that works. Okay? It has to come from those spores, those live spores. Okay? And dealing with COVID-19, that's why there was a lot of confusion even in China. Now, I'm not saying we need to trust everything that's coming out of China, but let's be realistic. That's why they didn't have all the information they needed originally, because they didn't know. Now, we hope that they acted ethically, and the minute they knew it, they let everybody know. Okay? But again, they didn't know. All right? So make sure you're understanding this whole human-to-human transmission, dealing with Ebola and dealing with other diseases. So make sure you understand what fatal disease are associated with, what's non-fatal case typically improves in 6 to 11 days after symptoms. These are things that just we want to know so we can provide that care for that patient. You say, why do we care, how long they stay sick? Because that lets our hospital knows how packed they're going to be, right? That's why we're worried about COVID-19 coming back in the fall when we have other people. We know in the winter people get sick, right? They get pneumonia, they get bronchitis. They're more prone to that, right? They're more prone to getting the seasonal flu. And then if we have COVID-19 on top of it, we are worried that we will overwhelm our healthcare system, okay? Which we can't have, because then if you have a heart attack or you have cancer or you have a stroke or you get in a car wreck or your kid has a bad asthma attack, where are you going to go? Hospitals are full, right? So this is why these numbers of how long it takes people to get well, how long are they sick, these numbers are vitally important to help us plan, right? We want to be able to plan for stuff. Okay, guys, that's the end. All right, so these are all the videos that you would have for your lecture. So watch your videos, read your chapters, fill out your study guides, and study this material. And then you have specific study guides for your lecture final and for your lab final, and start studying that. Because once you take lab quiz number 5 and lecture quiz number 5, you have no more tests until the final. I will be sending you out an email as fast as I can, okay, to give you the information on the rest of your case studies. If you finished the rest of your case studies and you feel good about them, go ahead and send them in. Okay, I'm grading those. I'm gonna get those grades up, and watch your lab videos as well, and then just get ready for your final. And I'll get with you guys. You're gonna have plenty of time to take that, because once you get 5 out of the way, then you have the time left to study for your final. Okay? Take care, and I'll see you guys soon.